There are generals who win battles through charisma, through speeches, through force of personality, and then there are generals who win through calculation. Hermann Hoth belonged to the latter. A strategist of armoured warfare, he believed that victory was not decided by intensity, but by timing. He studied terrain the way a chess master studies a board. He measured distance, not in kilometres, but in moments, the thin slice of time when tanks could strike before the enemy understood what was happening. Hoth did not command from behind a polished desk. He rode in command tanks, lived inside the dust and fumes of the advance, and watched battles unfold through binoculars fogged with sweat and exhaust. His instinct for movement made him a star in an era of steel. But instinct can be a dangerous gift when it is used to serve a regime that feeds on destruction. Born into the traditions of the old imperial army, Hoth absorbed the values of that world: discipline, duty, obedience. He came from a long line of soldiers. His path was laid out before him as surely as rails beneath a locomotive. In the First World War, he fought as a young officer, surviving the trenches while learning that static warfare was death. After the war, like many German officers, he watched the future take shape, not in the pages of Doctrine, but in the roar of engines. Tanks were not machines. He realized they were momentum. They were shock. They were the future, and Hoth wanted to ride the future like a tide. When Hitler rose to power, Hoth did not question. He saluted. He followed. He embraced the rapid expansion of the new armoured forces. Under the direction of men like Guderian, Hoth became one of the earliest and sharpest minds to understand how tanks could change the world. Blitzkrieg was not magic. It was math layered onto instinct. It demanded commanders who could read chaos as if it were a map, who could understand that hesitation kills faster than bullets. Hoth excelled. During the invasion of France, he led armoured units that sliced through French defences with terrifying speed. Radio coordination, flanking movement, shock penetration, Hoth used them with surgical precision. Towns fell, lines ruptured, entire divisions crumbled in hours. The world watched in disbelief. A nation that had been paralysed in trenches 20 years earlier moved with the speed of a lightning storm. And then came the East. When Operation Barbarossa launched the largest invasion the world had ever seen, Hoth commanded an armoured group tasked with driving deep into Soviet territory. His panzers thundered across the plains, engines roaring through fields of wheat and sunflower, dust climbing into the sky like smoke from wildfire. Villages vanished behind them. Soviet armies shattered, disintegrating under the pressure of manoeuvre warfare, executed with frightening precision. Hoth did not just chase victory, he chased velocity. He believed that hesitation was surrender. He believed that the moment a commander stopped moving, he started dying. But the Eastern Front had a way of stripping illusions. Hoth followed orders without questioning where those orders led. He worked alongside mobile SS units that left mass graves in forests and ravines. Civilians were swept into deportations. Villages burned. Hoth was not an ignorant bystander. He signed directives encouraging harsh measures and endorsed brutal anti-partisan policies that bled into atrocities. The brilliance of his tactics cannot be separated from the darkness they served. He was a master of armoured warfare, and he used that mastery to support a system of murder. In the summer of 1942, Hoth reached his peak. Commanding forces in the southern sector, he pushed toward the Volga. His tanks approached Stalingrad from the north, nearly linking with Sixth Army. The Volga shimmered ahead of him, a ribbon of water that represented both triumph and danger. If his forces could control these banks, Germany could choke the Soviet Union's supply lines. But the battle became a wound that refused to close. Stalingrad was not a city, it was a grinder. Buildings became fortresses. Factories became worlds. Every metre cost blood. Hoth manoeuvred, searched for openings, threw armour into narrow corridors of rubble, but the Soviet defence refused to break. Winter arrived. Supplies vanished. Hoth begged to withdraw. Hitler refused. Momentum finally failed. After Stalingrad, Hoth led another armoured operation, a last desperate attempt to regain the initiative. Kursk. A colossal tank battle, machines screaming across open fields, the largest armoured collision in history. Hoth pushed forward with everything he had, but the Soviets were ready. Mines, trenches, anti-tank zones, artillery. The claws of blitzkrieg broke against them. Hoth's armoured spearhead became dulled. He was relieved of command. After the war, he was tried for war crimes, not because of tactics, but because of orders he signed that permitted reprisals against civilians. He defended himself with the same argument many officers used: obedience, duty, following orders. History was not persuaded. He served time in prison. Hermann Hoth died quietly, not celebrated, not remembered by parades or monuments. His legacy became a warning. Brilliant tactics are meaningless when they serve evil. He mastered the art of movement, but he never learnt the danger of direction. Tonight, we return to those battlefields, to the roar of engines in the Ukrainian summer, to the frozen riverside near Stalingrad, to the moment when speed met consequence. This is the entire history of Hermann Hoth, a master of armoured warfare, a tactician of breathtaking talent, and a reminder that skill without morality becomes a weapon with no conscience. Before we begin, I want something from you. Not information about history, information about this moment. Where are you right now as you listen? Are you lying beneath a blanket in a dark room while the rest of the world sleeps? Or are you sitting somewhere quiet, letting the past pull you away from your day for a little while? And what time is it where you are, the stillness of early morning or the softness of late night? It helps me picture exactly where this story lands. And if these slow, immersive journeys into history help you unwind, focus, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. It tells me that these stories matter to someone, and it keeps me inspired to create the next chapter for you. April 12th, 1885, Neuruppin, Brandenburg. A child is born into a world of parade grounds and Prussian discipline, where military service isn't a choice, but a birthright passed down like silverware. Hermann Hoth enters a family where his father, a military medical officer, wears the same grey-green uniform that his grandfather wore, and his grandfather before him. In the nursery of this modest home, there are no toys of merchants or scholars. There are wooden soldiers, maps of European battlefields, and the unspoken expectation that this boy will continue a tradition stretching back through centuries of German martial culture. The weight of history settles on infant shoulders before those shoulders can even bear it. To understand Hoth, you must first understand the world that forged him. Prussian military culture in the late 19th century wasn't merely about fighting wars, it was a complete philosophy of life, a religion of order and duty. Officers' sons attended special academies where they learned mathematics through artillery calculations and geography through campaign studies. The Prussian system emphasized something unusual for its time: Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. Rather than rigid orders, commanders received objectives and were expected to use initiative and intelligence to achieve them. This wasn't democratic, it was aristocratic, genius. The idea that properly trained officers could be trusted to think. Young Hermann absorbed these lessons before he could articulate them. Watching his father treat wounded soldiers, seeing how the military machine functioned as both brutal and precise. In 1903, at 18 years old, Hoth walked through the gates of the military academy at Gross-Lichterfeld, just outside Berlin. The institution was legendary, a crucible that transformed boys into officers through a combination of classical education and relentless physical training. Cadets rose at 5 in the morning for drills that left their boots bloody. They studied Clausewitz and Moltke alongside Latin and French. They learned to ride horses at full gallop while firing pistols, to read topographical maps in darkness, to make decisions under manufactured stress. Hoth excelled not through physical dominance but through something rarer: analytical intelligence combined with unshakable composure. His instructors noted in their evaluations that young Hoth possessed an unusual ability to see battlefields in his mind, to visualize movements of troops like pieces on a chessboard. He graduated in 1904 as a lieutenant in the 18th Infantry Regiment, just in time for the world to change forever. August 1914 arrived like a thunderclap. Hoth, now a junior officer leading his first platoon, marched into Belgium as part of the great German offensive that was supposed to end the war by Christmas. The plan was elegant on paper: sweep through neutral Belgium, encircle Paris, force French surrender in 6 weeks. Reality proved uglier than theory. Hoth's first taste of combat came near Liège, where Belgian forts with modern artillery shredded German infantry columns advancing in parade ground formations. He watched men he'd eaten breakfast with torn apart by shrapnel. He learned that pre-war doctrine, with its emphasis on offensive spirit and bayonet charges, was suicide against machine guns. The magnificent Prussian army, trained for manoeuvre and decisive victory, found itself stuck in a grinding stalemate that would consume 4 years and millions of lives. The Western Front became Hoth's University of Industrial Warfare. As the conflict dragged from 1914 through 1915 and beyond, he rose to captain and witnessed every failure of doctrine that would later inform his revolutionary thinking. Massed infantry attacks gained yards at the cost of thousands of casualties. Artillery barrages announced offensives days in advance, eliminating surprise. Communication between front lines and headquarters relied on runners who were often killed before delivering messages. Hoth filled notebooks with observations, sketching diagrams of failed attacks and noting what went wrong. He was learning what not to do, cataloguing the bankruptcy of attrition warfare. The Prussian tradition of officer initiative was being crushed under the weight of industrial mass, and thoughtful men like Hoth recognized that something fundamental needed to change. November 1917 brought revelation in the form of British Mark IV tanks at the Battle of Cambrai. Hoth was stationed in a reserve position when reports flooded in British forces had broken through German lines to a depth of 5 miles in a single day without preparatory bombardment. The weapon that accomplished this miracle was armoured, tracked, and apparently immune to machine gun fire. Hoth rushed forward to examine a captured tank, walking around the steel beast with fascination and horror. Here was a machine that could restore mobility to warfare, that could protect advancing troops from the machine gun fire that had created 4 years of stalemate. The British used them poorly, committing reserves too slowly, allowing the Germans to recover and counterattack, but Hoth saw the potential that the British themselves seemed not to fully grasp. In his journal, that night, he wrote that whoever properly developed armoured warfare would dominate the next conflict. The war ended in November 1918 with Germany's defeat, but for officers like Hoth, the real education was just beginning. The Treaty of Versailles reduced the German army to 100,000 men, banned tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft, and seemed designed to ensure Germany could never threaten its neighbours again. To the victorious Allies, these restrictions were justice. To German officers, they were a challenge to be overcome through intelligence rather than mass. Hoth found himself in a peculiar position, part of a tiny, elite army that couldn't rely on overwhelming numbers or modern weapons. The restrictions forced German military thinkers toward innovation. If you can't build tanks, you study them obsessively. If you can't maintain a large army, you make every man an expert. The Weimar Republic's Reichswehr became a thinking man's army, and Hoth was perfectly suited to this new environment. The 1920s found Hoth in staff positions and teaching roles, part of a cadre of officers determined to prepare for a conflict they believed inevitable. He studied British and French armour theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Charles de Gaulle. Ironically, the Germans paid more attention to these foreign innovators than their own governments did. He attended secret seminars where officers wargamed future conflicts using hypothetical weapons Germany wasn't allowed to possess. In 1926, Hoth lectured at the Kriegsakademie, Berlin's premier military academy, developing courses on mobile warfare that existed only in theory. His teaching emphasized tempo and disruption over attrition, psychological paralysis over physical destruction. He argued that future wars would be won by forces that could strike faster than enemies could respond, getting inside the enemy's decision cycle and creating collapse through confusion rather than firepower alone. What distinguished Hoth from many contemporaries was his systematic approach to revolution. While some officers fantasized about warrior spirit and offensive élan, Hoth focused on mechanics, logistics, communications, maintenance, combined arms, coordination. He understood that successful armoured warfare required more than just tanks. You needed motorised infantry to exploit breakthroughs, mobile artillery to suppress defences, engineers to clear obstacles, and above all, reliable radio communications to coordinate actions across a fluid battlefield. In 1931, he published a paper titled The Cooperation of Arms in Mobile Warfare that analysed how different military branches must function as a synchronised organism. The paper was read by everyone serious about military modernization, including a junior officer named Heinz Guderian, who would later claim many of these ideas as his own. By 1933, when Hitler took power and Germany began openly rearming, Hoth was 48 years old, late middle age by military standards. He had spent 2 decades studying a form of warfare that didn't yet exist, preparing for battles with weapons he'd never commanded. Lesser men would have been forgotten, relegated to desk jobs as younger officers took the glamorous new Panzer divisions, but Hoth's moment was arriving. Everything he'd observed in the First World War, every lesson from Britain's failed tank attacks, every theoretical discussion in secret seminars was about to be tested. The restrictions of Versailles were being torn up. Germany was building tanks by the hundreds, then thousands, and men who'd thought deeply about how to use them properly were suddenly invaluable. Hoth received orders to prepare for command of a mechanized division. The inheritance of iron, passed from his father and grandfather, had evolved into something they never imagined: mastery of steel and speed, the transformation of warfare itself. February 19th, 1922. Kazan, Soviet Russia. A German officer in civilian clothes steps off a train 1,500 miles east of Berlin into a city where east meets west and secrets can be buried. Hermann Hoth isn't supposed to be here. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbids German officers from training with prohibited weapons. But Hoth and dozens of his colleagues have travelled through neutral countries using false papers to reach this unlikely destination, a partnership with the new Soviet government that's as pragmatic as it is bizarre. Germany needs testing grounds for tanks it can't legally build. Soviet Russia needs German military expertise. Both nations are pariahs of Versailles, and they found common cause in mutual isolation. In guarded facilities outside the city, German engineers will test tank prototypes while German officers learn to command armoured formations. The instruction happens in secret, recorded in files that will be burned if discovery threatens. Hoth is here to help invent the future. The irony is almost poetic. Germany's greatest military innovations in the 1920s occurred in Soviet Russia, their ideological opposite and eventual mortal enemy. The Kazan Tank School wasn't just about vehicles. Hoth and his colleagues were solving fundamental problems of mechanized warfare that no one had properly addressed. How do you coordinate dozens of tanks spread across miles of terrain without losing cohesion? How do you communicate orders when radio technology is still primitive? How do you integrate tanks with infantry and artillery when each moves at radically different speeds? These weren't theoretical questions. At Kazan, officers conducted live exercises with actual armour, testing formations and tactics. Hoth commanded mock attacks across Russian steppes, learning viscerally how tanks could mass for breakthrough, but also how quickly they could become separated and vulnerable if not properly supported. What made these exercises valuable wasn't just the practice, it was the intellectual environment. The Treaty of Versailles had forced Germany to develop quality over quantity, and the officers at Kazan represented the cream of military thinking. Hoth found himself in discussions with men like Heinz Guderian, Walther Nering, and Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma. They debated endlessly. Should tanks operate independently or in support of infantry? Should armoured divisions be concentrated or distributed across the front? How deep should an exploitation penetrate before pausing to consolidate? These conversations, held in drafty barracks, with snow outside and vodka on the table, were forging the doctrine that would conquer France. Hoth argued consistently for a balanced approach. Yes, tanks should strike deep, but they needed infantry and artillery following closely, and they needed realistic logistics. He was already seeing problems that more aggressive theorists ignored by 1926. Hoth had returned to Germany and taken a position at the Kriegsakademie, the War Academy in Berlin. Officially, he taught infantry tactics. Unofficially, he was preparing the next generation for mechanized warfare. His lectures had to be carefully worded to avoid violating Versailles restrictions, but his students understood perfectly well what he was really discussing. When Hoth described rapid infantry movement supported by mobile fire platforms, everyone knew he meant tanks and motorized units. When he emphasized exploitation of breakthrough to enemy rear areas, he was teaching the deep penetration that would later be called blitzkrieg. His classroom techniques were innovative. He used large-scale maps and tokens representing units, having students command both sides in scenarios that tested decision-making under pressure. Officers who attended his courses in the late 20s later commanded panzer divisions in the 40s. 1929 brought a crucial development. Hoth encountered the writings of British armour theorist J.F.C. Fuller. Fuller's book, The Reformation of War, argued that future conflicts would be won not by mass armies but by small, highly mobile forces capable of paralysing enemy command and logistics. Fuller envisioned armoured forces striking like a rapier to the brain rather than a bludgeon to the body. Hoth read the book 3 times, filling the margins with notes. He agreed with Fuller's vision, but recognised implementation problems the British theorist glossed over. Fuller treated logistics almost as an afterthought, assuming supply would somehow keep pace with rapid advance. Hoth knew better. From his World War I experience, armies ran on fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. A breakthrough that outraced its supply lines would wither and die. He began developing logistical frameworks for deep operations, unglamorous work that would prove essential. The most surreal aspect of Germany's rearmament preparation was its openness to foreign ideas. While British and French military establishments largely ignored their own innovators, German officers studied Fuller, Liddell Hart, de Gaulle, and others obsessively. Hoth assigned these foreign works to his students. The German military culture of Auftragstaktik, trusting officers to think independently, extended to intellectual inquiry. If an idea was good, its national origin didn't matter. This created a strange situation where German officers in the early 30s understood British and French armour theory better than most British and French officers did. Hoth lectured on de Gaulle's proposals for French armoured divisions, explaining why they were brilliant in concept but why the French High Command would likely never implement them. He was right. France built excellent tanks but used them in dispersed infantry support roles rather than concentrated masses. 1932 brought an encounter that would shape the next decade. Hoth attended a Berlin conference where Heinz Guderian presented his vision for panzer divisions, all-tank formations that would operate independently from infantry. Guderian was charismatic and absolute in his certainty. Hoth listened carefully and then raised objections. Pure tank formations would be vulnerable to anti-tank defences without infantry support. They would outrun their artillery cover, they would create logistics nightmares. Guderian dismissed these concerns as timid thinking, the caution of old men. Other officers in the room sensed tension here, were 2 strong personalities with different philosophies. Hoth wasn't opposed to armoured warfare. He'd been studying it longer than Guderian. But he believed in balanced combined arms, in sustainable operations, in thinking 3 moves ahead. Guderian believed in audacity and speed above all else. Both men would be proven right and wrong in different circumstances, but their rivalry was born in that conference room. January 1933 changed everything. Hitler became Chancellor, and within months, Germany began openly rearming. The secret was out: the underground training, the theoretical studies, the prototype testing in Russia. Now it would become real. Factories that had surreptitiously designed tanks in the 20s began building them by the hundreds. The tiny Reichswehr expanded into the Wehrmacht, growing from 100,000 to over 500,000 within 2 years. Officers who'd spent a decade teaching hypothetical armoured warfare suddenly had actual panzer divisions to command. Hoth, now 48, received promotion to General Major and command of an infantry division with instructions to prepare it for mechanization. The classroom was closing. The battlefield was opening. What's striking about this period is how much intellectual groundwork preceded the actual weapons. By the time German factories produced tanks in quantity, German officers had 15 years of theoretical development, secret training, and doctrinal refinement. They'd made their mistakes in peacetime, argued through the problems, developed solutions. When British and French officers first encountered German armour tactics in 1940, they faced an enemy who'd been thinking about these problems since 1920. Hoth embodied this preparation. He wasn't naturally aggressive or flamboyant like Guderian, but he'd systematically studied every aspect of mechanized warfare. He knew how to coordinate air and ground forces. He understood logistics down to fuel consumption rates per kilometre. He'd wargamed breakthrough scenarios dozens of times. The inheritance from his Prussian ancestors had been transformed through a secret academy of innovation into something unprecedented. By 1939, as Germany prepared for war, Hoth commanded XV Corps, one of the first fully motorized formations in the Wehrmacht. His units practiced coordinated advances with tanks, infantry, and artillery moving together. They conducted night marches to improve logistics. They trained radio operators until communication became instinctive. Hoth's staff officers knew their commander's reputation, brilliant but demanding, expecting perfection in planning and execution. He didn't tolerate sloppiness or improvisation when proper preparation would suffice. His corps was ready not just for battle, but for a specific type of battle that most of the world didn't yet understand. The secret academy had graduated its students. The exam was about to begin. And the examiners would be Polish defenders who had no idea what was coming toward them across the border. Not just an army, but a revolution in warfare itself, forged in hidden facilities and lecture halls, tested in snow and theory, now finally unleashed in steel and fire. October 15th, 1935. Potsdam, Germany. Hermann Hoth watches from a reviewing stand as the 1st Panzer units parade through streets where Frederick the Great once drilled infantry. The tanks are small Panzer I and II models, thinly armoured, armed with machine guns or 20mm cannons. They're training vehicles, really placeholders until better designs arrive. But they exist, and that's revolutionary enough. Hitler stands nearby, grinning at foreign military attachés who've come to witness Germany's open defiance of Versailles. Hoth's emotions are complicated. He's spent 15 years preparing for this moment, yet these prototype machines are inadequate for real war. The tracks throw sparks on cobblestones. Engines overheat after 30 minutes of operation. But they're learning platforms. And Hoth has just received command of the 18th Infantry Division with orders to prepare it for mechanization. The theoretical is becoming actual, and all the problems he foresaw in classroom discussions are about to become concrete challenges. The period from 1935 to 1939 represents Germany's crash course in practical armoured warfare. Building tanks proved easier than building the institutions around them. Hoth's 18th Division had to invent everything from scratch: maintenance protocols, supply chains, coordination procedures. How many spare parts should a Panzer company carry? What fuel consumption should planners expect on different terrain? How do you repair tracks in field conditions? These unglamorous questions had life or death implications. Hoth appointed logisticians to his staff, with the same care as combat commanders, recognizing that battles would be won or lost based on whether tanks had fuel and ammunition when they needed it. His division conducted exercises obsessively, sometimes 3 or 4 days a week, learning through repetition what worked and what failed. Spring 1937 brought the first real test Wehrmacht maneuvers in Bavaria involving over 50,000 troops and several hundred tanks. Hoth's division participated alongside Guderian's panzer formations, and the exercises revealed both promise and problems. In the attack phase, German tanks achieved breakthrough speeds that no previous army had matched, advancing 20 to 30 kilometers in a day compared to the walking pace of World War I. Coordination between tanks and dive bombers was particularly impressive. Stuka aircraft acted as flying artillery, suppressing defences just ahead of armoured spearheads. But the exercises also showed catastrophic mechanical failure rates. 30% of tanks broke down during a single day's march, transmissions failed, engines overheated, tracks through. Hoth's maintenance crews worked through the night making repairs, and he documented every failure in reports to high command. The technology was revolutionary but unreliable, and that unreliability could be fatal against a determined enemy. March 1938 provided an unplanned but crucial test, the Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria. Hoth's division participated in the bloodless occupation, marching 600 kilometres through Austria to demonstrate German power. No one fired a shot, but the operation was almost catastrophic for reasons that would prove prophetic. 30% of German vehicles broke down during the march. Tanks designed for short-distance tactical manoeuvres struggled with extended road travel. Civilian roads couldn't support heavy armour, and the infrastructure of occupied territory wasn't prepared for military logistics. Hoth spent days coordinating repair efforts, dispatching fuel trucks to stranded units, improvising solutions. The lesson was stark. Even unopposed, advances over long distances stressed German equipment beyond design limits. He filed detailed reports warning that any future campaign requiring deep penetration would face similar logistics challenges. Few people in high command wanted to hear about limitations when Hitler was talking about swift, decisive victories. By late 1938, Hoth had been promoted to General der Infanterie and given command of XV Corps, one of the first fully motorized formations in German military history. This wasn't just a panzer division, it was an entire corps with tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and support units all capable of moving together. The organizational challenge was immense. Different vehicle types had different speeds, fuel consumption rates, and maintenance requirements. Infantry in trucks couldn't keep pace with tanks in open terrain, but were essential for securing occupied ground. Artillery needed roads that tanks could bypass. Hoth spent months developing marching protocols, how to sequence different units to maintain formation cohesion, where to position supply vehicles, how to defend while in motion. His staff became experts in time-distance calculations, planning movements with mathematical precision. The technology was evolving rapidly, but not fast enough. By 1939, German factories were producing Panzer III and IV models, proper battle tanks with 37mm and short-barreled 75mm guns. These were vast improvements over early prototypes, but Hoth knew they were still inferior to the best French tanks. The French Char B1 had 70mm frontal armour and a 75mm gun that could destroy any German tank. The Soviet 34, which German intelligence was just beginning to learn about, was even better. German advantages weren't in equipment quality, they were in doctrine, training, and organisation. Hoth understood this viscerally. His corps practiced coordination until it became instinctive. Every tank commander had radio communication. Infantry trained with tanks until they understood each other's capabilities and limitations. Artillery officers learned to displace rapidly to support advancing armour. Summer 1939 saw XV Corps conducting its final pre-war exercises. Hoth pushed his units hard, running scenarios that lasted 72 hours without pause to simulate real campaign conditions. He wanted to know what happened when soldiers were exhausted, when vehicles were overused, when supply lines stretched thin. The exercises revealed uncomfortable truths. After 48 hours of continuous operations, mechanical failure rates exceeded 50%. Soldiers became dangerously fatigued, making errors in judgment. Command and control degraded as radio operators struggled to maintain communication while moving. Hoth documented all of this, writing reports that essentially predicted the problems Germany would face in Russia 2 years later. His recommendations were thorough but would be largely ignored. Pause operational tempo regularly to conduct maintenance, don't outrun logistics, plan for mechanical attrition rates of 20 to 30% per week of operations. August 19th, 1939. XV Corps received deployment orders, moved to positions near the Polish border. War was imminent, though officially undeclared. Hoth's units travelled by night, spreading out to prevent aerial detection, occupying assembly areas in East Prussian forests. The Corps now numbered 25,000 men and over 250 tanks, a concentration of mobile firepower unprecedented in military history. Hoth held final briefings with his division commanders, reviewing objectives, coordination procedures, exploitation plans. The briefings were serious but confident. These men had trained together for years. They understood the doctrine. They trusted their equipment despite its flaws. Most importantly, they believed in the fundamental superiority of their operational approach speed and coordination over static defence, manoeuvre over attrition. The contrast with Poland's military was stark, though neither side fully understood it yet. Polish forces were numerous and brave, but doctrinally obsolete, organised for World War I-style positional warfare. Polish tanks were dispersed to support infantry, rather than concentrated for breakthrough. Polish communications relied heavily on civilian telephone networks that German bombers would destroy in the first hours of war. Polish cavalry divisions were mobile but vulnerable to modern firepower. Hoth studied intelligence reports on Polish deployments and recognised the vulnerability of strong frontier forces but weak reserves, defensive lines that could be penetrated and bypassed, no strategic depth. He briefed his commanders to expect initial resistance, followed by rapid collapse once breakthrough was achieved. They would test theories developed over 15 years in the first real battle of armoured warfare. September 1st, 1939, 04:45. hour approached. Hoth stood in his command post, reviewing final reports. His corps was as ready as training could make it, soldiers knew. Their jobs? Vehicles were fueled and armed. Coordination procedures had been rehearsed until automatic. But this was theory meeting reality, classroom scenarios becoming actual combat. Hoth had studied tank warfare longer than almost anyone in the Wehrmacht, but he'd never commanded armour in battle. None of them had. The Panzers had awakened from their secret slumber, had trained and manoeuvred and prepared. Now they would discover if revolutionary doctrine could survive contact with an actual enemy. In 30 minutes, artillery would open fire. In an hour, tanks would cross the border. And Hermann Hoth, student of war, architect of theory, inheritor of Prussian tradition, would finally learn whether 15 years of preparation had created something genuinely new or just another military fantasy destined to collapse under the weight of reality. The engines were running. Dawn was coming. And history was waiting to be written in the dust of Polish roads. September 1st, 1939, 0445, German-Polish border. Artillery erupts along a 300-mile front, the sound rolling like thunder through morning darkness. Hermann Hoth's XV Corps begins advancing from East Prussia into Polish territory, spearheaded by armoured reconnaissance units, probing for weakness. The opening moves happen faster than any previous campaign in history. By 0600, German tanks have penetrated 15 kilometres. By noon, forward elements have covered 35 miles, leaving Polish frontier defenders stunned and bypassed. This is supposed to be easy. German propaganda has declared Polish inferiority, predicted victory in 3 weeks, but in his command vehicle, Hoth is already seeing complications. Radio reports describe stiffer resistance than expected. Tank losses from anti-tank guns and mechanical breakdown are mounting. And somewhere in the chaos between the propaganda and the reality, the true nature of this war is revealing itself. The myth of Poland would be written later stories of cavalry, charging tanks, of a backward nation crushed in days. The reality was more complex and more costly. Polish forces numbered 39 divisions, 800 tanks, and 900 aircraft. They were outnumbered and out-coordinated, but they weren't helpless. The Polish Corridor campaign, where Hoth's corps operated, saw serious fighting from the start. Polish Pomorska Cavalry Brigade, fighting dismounted as intended, held up German advances for 2 days at Krojanty. Polish anti-tank guns, often older French models, successfully engaged German armour when properly positioned. The fundamental problem wasn't Polish courage or equipment quality, it was doctrine and coordination. Polish forces were dispersed along the frontier trying to defend everything, while Germans concentrated at breakthrough points. Hoth's corps had 250 tanks in a narrow sector, facing Polish units, spread thin across hundreds of miles. September 3rd brought one of the campaign's pivotal moments, the Battle of the Tuchola Forest. Hoth's advance encountered the Polish 4th Infantry Division entrenched in forest positions with artillery support. This was exactly the scenario German doctrine was designed to exploit. Rather than conducting frontal infantry assaults like World War I, Hoth's tanks bypassed the forest while dive bombers suppressed Polish artillery. Motorised infantry then infiltrated the forest from multiple directions while tanks threatened the Polish rear. The battle lasted 6 hours and ended with 3,000 Polish prisoners and opened roads north. But it cost Hoth's corps a day's advance and revealed a crucial reality: even inferior forces could delay or damage armour if properly positioned in restrictive terrain. Forests, urban areas, and river crossings would be persistent problems throughout the campaign. By September 9th, XV Corps had reached the Vistula River, 120 kilometres from its starting point. In 9 days, Hoth's units had advanced farther than any army had moved during entire years of World War I. They'd encircled or destroyed multiple Polish divisions. They'd created chaos in Polish command and control, forcing constant retreats that prevented organised defensive lines. This was breakthrough warfare, working as designed speed, creating strategic effects beyond simple territorial gain. But the costs were accumulating in ways that concerned Hoth. His combat losses were relatively light, maybe 300 casualties, 20 tanks destroyed in combat. However, mechanical attrition was catastrophic. 150 tanks were inoperable due to breakdowns, thrown tracks, transmission failures, and overheated engines. That was 60% of his armour, and the enemy hadn't destroyed it. His own equipment's reliability had. The campaign's middle phase, September 9th through 17th, saw both triumph and frustration. Polish forces launched their largest counter-offensive at Bzura, striking the German 8th Army's flank with 12 divisions. The attack initially achieved surprise, capturing several towns and threatening to split German forces. High command panicked, diverting multiple units including elements of Hoth's corps to contain the breakthrough. Here the German system showed its strength, operational flexibility. Units from different corps, coordinated through radio communication, converging on the threatened sector without the rigid command structures that slowed Polish responses. Hoth's motorized infantry and artillery raced south, executing movements that would have taken days in World War I but now took hours. The Battle of Bzura became an encirclement, where German mobility trapped Polish forces attempting a mobile offensive. 150,000 Polish soldiers surrendered, but Hoth was learning expensive lessons. Motorized warfare's speed created opportunities, but also vulnerabilities. His units had advanced so rapidly that supply lines stretched to breaking points. Fuel trucks couldn't keep pace with tanks, forcing operational pauses while logistics caught up. Maintenance couldn't keep up with mechanical failures. Repair crews worked 20-hour days but fell further behind as vehicles broke faster than they could be fixed. Infantry riding in trucks for days developed problems, vehicles broke down, soldiers arrived exhausted, and the trucks themselves became targets, requiring protection. The theoretical elegance of mobile warfare was colliding with prosaic realities. Machines broke, men tired, distances mattered. Hoth documented all of this in daily reports, creating a record that would prove prescient but would be disregarded when planning the Russian campaign. September 17th brought a development that sealed Poland's fate but complicated the victory narrative. Soviet forces invaded from the east, implementing the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland now faced two enemies on opposite frontiers. Hoth's Corps, approaching Warsaw from the north, received orders to halt and allow Soviet forces their agreed-upon occupation zones. The Wehrmacht's rapid advance suddenly stopped, not because of Polish resistance, but because of diplomatic agreements. From Hoth's perspective, this was both relief and frustration relief, because his overextended units needed time for maintenance and resupply, frustration because the operational situation was incomplete. German forces had created pockets of encirclement, but hadn't eliminated all Polish forces. The Soviet entry ended the campaign politically, but left tactical loose ends. Warsaw fell on September 27th after a brutal siege. The Polish government fled to Romania. Isolated Polish units continued fighting into early October, but organised resistance collapsed. The campaign had lasted 36 days faster than any previous major European war. German propaganda declared a triumph of Aryan superiority and military genius. The Wehrmacht had validated its new doctrine and established armoured warfare as the future of land combat. But the internal military assessments, the ones Hoth read carefully, told a more nuanced story. German forces had suffered 16,000 killed and 32,000 wounded. Not catastrophic, but not trivial. Vehicle losses exceeded expectations. The Luftwaffe had lost nearly 400 aircraft. And, most concerning for planners like Hoth, mechanical attrition had been brutal. 674 tanks lost or damaged, representing 32% of deployed armour. 2/3 of those losses were mechanical, not combat damage. The post-campaign analysis session in October brought together senior commanders to evaluate performance. Hoth presented his findings with characteristic thoroughness. Yes, the operational doctrine worked, concentration, breakthrough, exploitation, created decisive results. Yes, coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft was effective, but he emphasized the problems. Mechanical reliability was inadequate for sustained operations. Logistics couldn't support advances beyond 200 kilometers without operational pauses. The Panzer I and II were obsolete. Their light armor and weak armament made them vulnerable to even modest anti-tank defenses. Infantry-tank coordination needed improvement. Too many instances of tanks advancing without infantry support and becoming vulnerable. His recommendations were specific. Increase production of Panzer III and IV, improve mechanical reliability through testing, develop better maintenance procedures, expand truck production for logistics, train more extensively on combined arms tactics. What Hoth understood, But what few people wanted to acknowledge was that Poland had been a relatively easy opponent. Polish doctrine was obsolete, their forces dispersed, their infrastructure underdeveloped. The Wehrmacht had faced an enemy still organised for World War I combat and had applied World War II methods. Naturally, they won. But what would happen against France, which had better tanks, stronger fortifications, and more developed infrastructure? What would happen if mechanical failure rates remained at 60%? What if logistics couldn't keep pace with exploitation? These questions haunted Hoth during the autumn of 1939 as Germany prepared for the Western campaign. The Panzers had awakened, had achieved their baptism of fire, had proven the basic validity of armoured warfare, but they'd also revealed limitations that doctrine alone couldn't overcome. The inheritance of Prussian military excellence had been transformed into mechanized reality, but that reality was fragile, dependent on perfect execution and favourable circumstances. Hoth had won his first test. The harder exams were still ahead. October 23rd, 1939. German-occupied Poland. Hermann Hoth walks through a vehicle park filled with damaged tanks, noting details in a leather-bound notebook. The Polish campaign ended 3 weeks ago, but the real work is just beginning the systematic evaluation of what succeeded and what failed. Maintenance crews have identified 187 separate mechanical failure modes across his Corps' vehicles. Hoth interviews junior officers about coordination problems, logistics officers about supply bottlenecks, radio operators about communication breakdowns. This is unglamorous work, the kind of detailed analysis that separates professional militaries from amateur ones. While Hitler gives speeches about German triumph and the Western powers prepare for a conflict they expect will resemble World War I, Hoth is rewriting tactical procedures based on hard-won lessons. The 8 months between Poland and France, the period history books call the Phony War, will prove crucial not because of dramatic events, but because of this kind of meticulous institutional learning. The Wehrmacht's capacity for adaptation was one of its genuine advantages, born from that Prussian tradition of Auftragstaktik that encouraged initiative and learning at every level. Hoth's staff spent November compiling after-action reports from every battalion in XV Corps. They identified 347 specific tactical problems and developed solutions for each. Tank infantry coordination improved through new procedures. Phone boxes mounted on tank hulls, allowing infantry to communicate with crews, revised hand signals, better training on mutual support. Artillery learned to displace more rapidly, developing protocols where gun crews could pack up, move 15 kilometres, and be ready to fire again in under 2 hours. The Luftwaffe and Army improved close air support by assigning liaison officers to ground units and developing coloured smoke signals to mark targets. These weren't revolutionary insights, they were the accumulation of hundreds of small improvements. Winter 1939 brought Hoth back to Germany for intensive training cycles. XV Corps was redesignated XV Panzer Corps and received priority for new equipment. The Panzer III Ausf E and F models arriving from factories represented significant improvements over Polish campaign variants, better armour, more reliable transmissions, improved radio sets. Hoth personally tested the new vehicles, driving them through muddy conditions, measuring how long engines took to warm up in cold weather, timing how fast crews could conduct field repairs. He was 54 years old, a senior general, but he understood that abstract leadership meant nothing if you didn't understand your tools. His staff joked that Herr General could probably disassemble and reassemble a Maybach engine faster than half the mechanics in the Corps. The doctrinal debates intensified as the Western campaign approached. Heinz Guderian advocated for maximum aggression. Tanks should penetrate as deeply and rapidly as possible, creating psychological collapse regardless of flank security or supply lines. Hoth argued for what he called rolling exploitation, maintain advance but coordinate with following infantry, secure flanks, ensure logistics keep pace. The arguments grew heated in staff meetings. Guderian accused Hoth of timidity, of thinking like an infantry general rather than a tank commander. Hoth countered that recklessness created disasters, pointing to Polish campaign instances where German tanks advanced too far and were temporarily cut off from supply. The debate revealed different philosophies. Guderian believed in operational gambling, that breakthrough was the supreme goal even at risk of failure. Hoth believed in managed risk, in exploitation that was sustainable and coordinated. Both men would get to test their theories. February 1940 brought Hoth to a crucial planning meeting, where Erich von Manstein presented his sickle-cut plan for invading France. The original German plan had been uninspired advance through Belgium, push French forces back, fight a grinding campaign. Manstein proposed something audacious: concentrate panzer forces for a thrust through the Ardennes forest, which French planners considered impassable for armour, break through at Sedan, drive to the English Channel to encircle Allied armies in Belgium. The plan was brilliant if it worked, catastrophic if it failed. Hoth studied the maps carefully and saw both promise and peril. Yes, the Ardennes approach offered surprise. Yes, French forces were deployed forward into Belgium, leaving the Sedan sector weakly held. But the Ardennes roads were narrow forest tracks. A single broken-down vehicle could block entire columns. And if French forces reacted quickly, German panzer spearheads could be cut off hundreds of kilometres from their infantry support. Hoth raised these concerns in the planning session, earning a reputation as a pessimist among more aggressive commanders. But his objections were detailed and constructive. He didn't oppose the plan. He wanted it improved. His recommendations focused on logistics and coordination, pre-position fuel and ammunition along the advance routes, assign engineers to improve Ardennes roads before the offensive, coordinate air reconnaissance to identify French reserves, develop contingency plans if the breakthrough stalled. Most importantly, establish clear boundaries between Panzer Corps to prevent traffic jams and friendly fire incidents. These suggestions were incorporated into the final plan, though Hoth remained privately sceptical. The plan depended on so many factors: going right surprise maintained, French reaction delayed, weather cooperating, mechanical breakdowns manageable, logistics keeping pace. It could succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically, and the difference might come down to chance. March and April brought intensive rehearsals. Hoth's XV Panzer Corps, now consisting of the 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions, practiced river crossings repeatedly. The Meuse River at Dinant would be their obstacle, 60 metres wide, defended by French forces in prepared positions. Crossing under fire would require perfect coordination between engineers, infantry, artillery, and air support. Hoth ran simulations obsessively, timing every phase, identifying potential bottlenecks. His engineers practiced assembling pontoon bridges until they could do it in darkness. Infantry trained on rubber assault boats. Artillery officers developed fire plans to suppress French defensive positions during the crossing. The 7th Panzer Division was commanded by Erwin Rommel, an aggressive infantry officer new to armoured command. Hoth recognised Rommel's talent, but worried about his tendency toward personal heroics rather than systematic command. May 9th, 1940. XV Panzer Corps received final deployment orders, moved to assembly areas near Luxembourg border, prepare for offensive beginning May 10th at 05:35. Hoth's units travel by night, tanks and vehicles spreading out to avoid congestion, reaching positions in forested areas. The Corps now represented a concentration of mechanized power that eclipsed anything in Poland: 2 full panzer divisions with over 320 tanks, motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, engineers, reconnaissance, anti-aircraft, everything needed for independent operations. Hoth held final briefings with his division commanders. The objectives were clear but daunting. Cross Luxembourg in 1 day, enter Ardennes forest, navigate forest roads, emerge at the Meuse River, force a crossing, break through into France, drive to the English Channel. On paper, this sequence would take weeks. The plan allocated 10 days. Hoth thought even that was optimistic. The contrast between German and Allied preparations was striking. French forces were numerous and well-equipped. The Char B-1 tank was superior to anything Germany fielded, French artillery was excellent, and total French and British forces outnumbered Germans. But Allied doctrine was defensive and static. Commanders were older and cautious, and most importantly, decision-making was centralised and slow. French headquarters communicated via telegraph and motorcycle courier because General Gammon distrusted radios. This meant French responses to German moves took 24 to 48 hours, an eternity in mobile warfare. German units had radio communication down to company level, allowing coordination in real time. Hoth's command vehicle could communicate simultaneously with both his divisions, Corps headquarters, and Luftwaffe liaison officers. This difference in communication technology would prove as decisive as any weapon system. Evening of May 9th. Hoth reviewed intelligence reports one final time. French Ninth Army held the sector opposite his corps. They were considered second-rate units, assigned to the quiet Ardennes sector because French planners assumed the forest terrain prevented large-scale armour attacks. This was both Germany's opportunity and its risk. If the French were weak, breakthrough was achievable. But if French High Command recognised the danger and rushed reserves to Sedan, Hoth's corps would be channelled in forest defiles, unable to manoeuvre, vulnerable to counterattack. Everything depended on speed and surprise, getting through the Ardennes before French could respond, forcing the Meuse crossing before defences were reinforced, exploiting into open country before containment was possible. It was the ultimate test of everything Hoth had studied for 25 years, everything the Wehrmacht had prepared for since Versailles. The doctrine had been refined through theory, training, and one campaign against a weaker opponent. Now it would face the premier army in Europe. In 6 hours, Hoth would discover if refinement was enough. May 10th, 1940, 05:35. German-Belgian border. 2 men command the fate of empires from positions 40 kilometers apart. Hermann Hoth's XV Panzer Corps begins its advance toward Dinant, while Heinz Guderian's Ex-Panzer Panzer Corps drives towards Sedan. They are executing the same strategic mission breakthrough at the Meuse, exploitation to the Channel but with fundamentally different philosophies. In their command vehicles, separated by distance but linked by radio and shared purpose, these 2 architects of armoured warfare embody a creative tension that makes German doctrine both brilliant and unstable. Guderian is famous, the self-promoting author whose book, Achtung Panzer, made him the public face of German tank warfare. Hoth is obscure, a staff officer's general who avoids publicity and trusts systematic planning over inspirational leadership. Their rivalry isn't personal hatred, it's philosophical disagreement about the nature of warfare itself, and over the next weeks, both approaches will be tested. The contrast between them runs deeper than personality. Guderian came to armour from a signals background, fascinated by technology and communication. He envisioned pure panzer formations, all-tank divisions that would operate independently, striking deep without worrying about flanks or infantry support. His tactical philosophy was summarised in 3 words: klotzen, nicht klecken. Strike concentrated, not dispersed. Hoth approached armour from infantry experience, having commanded foot soldiers throughout World War I. He believed tanks were revolutionary but not independent. They needed motorised infantry to secure terrain, artillery to suppress defences, engineers to overcome obstacles. His philosophy was combined arms warfare, where different branches worked as a synchronised organism. Both men were revolutionaries, but Guderian wanted to overthrow the old entirely, while Hoth wanted to transform it. Their theoretical disagreements had been mostly academic until 1940. In staff meetings during the 30s, they'd argued doctrine, Guderian insisting that tank formations should be homogeneous for maximum shock effect, Hoth countering that balanced divisions were more versatile and sustainable. In war games, Guderian's pure armour attacks often achieved spectacular breakthroughs but sometimes overextended and got surrounded. Hoth's balanced approach was slower but more consistent. Senior commanders tolerated both philosophies, recognising that different situations might require different methods. But now, in actual combat against France, the Wehrmacht would discover which approach worked better. Guderian's Ex-Panzer Panzer Corps had 3 panzer divisions, the 1st, 2nd and 10th. Hoth's XV Panzer Corps had 2, the 5th and 7th. Both would strike the Meuse on May 13th, and the results would vindicate and condemn aspects of each commander's vision. May 13th, 1940. The 2 corps reached the Meuse simultaneously after 3 days of advance through the Ardennes. Guderian's approach to Sedan was characteristically aggressive. He'd pushed his divisions relentlessly, accepting mechanical breakdowns and strung out formations to maintain tempo. By the time his lead elements reached the river, they'd lost radio contact with trailing units, but Guderian didn't care. Speed was everything. He ordered immediate assault crossings without waiting for full corps concentration. Infantry crossed in rubber boats under devastating fire from French positions. Luftwaffe Stukas provided close air support in carefully coordinated waves. By nightfall, Guderian had bridgeheads across the Meuse, though at terrible cost, his Grossdeutschland regiment suffered 40% casualties in a single afternoon. But he'd achieved breakthrough, and that justified everything. Hoth's crossing at Dinant, 40 kilometres north, proceeded differently. He'd maintained tighter formation through the Ardennes, accepting slower pace to keep his divisions coordinated. When the 7th Panzer Division under Rommel reached Dinant on the evening of May 12th, Hoth ordered reconnaissance and preparation rather than immediate assault. Engineers surveyed crossing sites, artillery registered targets on French positions. Infantry conducted limited probes to identify defensive layouts. Rommel chafed at the delay. His instinct was to attack immediately, like Guderian. But Hoth insisted on proper preparation. The assault began at dawn on May 13th with coordinated artillery bombardment, Stuka strikes, and infantry crossings at multiple points simultaneously. Rommel personally led from the front, wading across the river with his troops in a display of courage that bordered on recklessness. By afternoon, Hoth had his bridgehead with notably lower casualties than Guderian's sector. The breakthrough phase revealed the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. Guderian, with bridgeheads secured, immediately exploited westward without waiting for higher authorization. On May 14th, his lead elements advanced 60 kilometers, leaving French defenders stunned. He ignored orders from Army Group Command to consolidate, arguing that momentum was paramount. "I took the risk," he would write later. His gamble paid off. French forces couldn't organize coherent response to units appearing 30, 40, 50 kilometers behind their defensive lines. But Guderian's rapid advance created chaos in German logistics. Supply trucks couldn't keep pace, flank security was minimal. His divisions became separated across 100 kilometers of French countryside, vulnerable to counterattack that fortunately never materialized with sufficient strength. Hoth's exploitation from Dinant was more methodical and, in retrospect, more sustainable. He advanced his corps as a coordinated formation, tanks in front, motorized infantry following, artillery moving in bounds to maintain fire support. His advance averaged 35 kilometers per day compared to Guderian's 45, but his formation remained intact, his logistics functioned, and his flanks were secured. When French forces attempted counterattacks against his advancing columns, Hoth's balanced combined arms could respond effectively. His motorized infantry could form defensive hedgehogs while tanks maneuvered. His artillery could mass fires rapidly. The 7th Panzer Division under Rommel occasionally outran coordination, leading Hoth to send sharp radio messages ordering Rommel to maintain formation friction between the systematic corps commander and his impetuous division commander. May 20th marked the operational culmination when lead elements of both Guderian's and Hoth's corps reached the English Channel at Abbeville, cutting off Allied forces in Belgium. The achievement was extraordinary. In 10 days, German armour had penetrated 300 kilometres of French territory, encircled over 1 million enemy troops, and achieved strategic victory. Both Guderian's aggressive approach and Hoth's methodical approach had contributed. Guderian's rapid exploitation prevented French from organising defensive lines. Hoth's sustainable advance ensured continuous pressure without dangerous gaps. The victory seemed to validate both philosophies, suggesting German success came from flexibility to apply different methods in different circumstances. But May 21st brought crisis that revealed the limitations of aggressive exploitation. At Arras, British forces with heavy Matilda tanks counterattacked into Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, which had advanced ahead of Hoth's main body. The attack penetrated several kilometres, temporarily cutting off Rommel's forward units. German 37mm anti-tank guns bounced off Matilda armour. Panic spread through supporting SS units. Rommel personally directed 88mm anti-aircraft guns in ground roll, the only weapons capable of stopping the British tanks. Hoth rushed artillery and infantry reinforcements to stabilise the situation. The crisis was contained, but it demonstrated what could happen when armour advanced without proper support. Guderian's corps, even further extended, was potentially vulnerable to similar counterattacks that never came. The aftermath of France crystallised the Hoth-Guderian dynamic in Wehrmacht consciousness. Guderian became a celebrity. Hitler promoted him. He gave interviews. He became the face of blitzkrieg success. His aggressive style matched Nazi ideology of willpower and audacity. Hoth received less recognition, promoted but not celebrated. His careful, professional approach lacked dramatic appeal. Yet senior military professionals recognized what operational statistics revealed. Guderian's XIX Panzer Corps suffered 12% casualties in the French campaign and lost 42% of its tanks to combat and mechanical failure. Hoth's XV Panzer Corps suffered only 4% casualties and lost 28% of its tanks. Both achieved their objectives, but Hoth did so more efficiently and sustainably. The question was whether sustainability mattered when aggressive exploitation won decisive victories. The rivalry would continue throughout the war, never resolved because both men were right in different contexts. Guderian's aggression worked when enemies were vulnerable to psychological collapse, when strategic situation allowed risk-taking, when initial success could be exploited before enemy recovered. Hoth's methodology worked when facing competent enemies, when logistics were stretched, when sustainable operations mattered more than spectacular breakthroughs. In Russia, both would be tested beyond their limits. Guderian would be relieved in December 1941 for unauthorized retreats, vindicated in 1943 when recalled to rebuild panzer forces, then dismissed again in 1945. Hoth would last longer, commanding through Stalingrad before his final relief. But in May 1940, as panzers rolled through France and the Wehrmacht seemed invincible, both men had proven themselves masters of mechanized warfare. The tragedy was that their excellence would be employed in service of a criminal regime, their tactical brilliance enabling strategic evil. Two rivals, two philosophies, one terrible cause, and ahead lay the ultimate test where even genius would not suffice. May 10th, 1940, dawn, Luxembourg border. The lead reconnaissance vehicles of Hermann Hoth's XV Panzer Corps cross into neutral territory, beginning an operation that will change warfare forever. Behind them, stretching back 30 kilometres, 320 tanks and supporting vehicles wait in forested assembly areas. The entire column, if stretched linearly, would extend 80 kilometres, but it won't move linearly. German doctrine emphasises infiltration, using every road and track simultaneously, presenting multiple threats that confuse defenders. By 0800, Hoth's lead elements have covered 40 kilometres and reached Belgian frontier. No significant resistance, Luxembourg's tiny army withdrew rather than fight. The operation is unfolding exactly as planned, which makes Hoth suspicious. Warfare rarely cooperates with plans. Somewhere ahead, something will go wrong. The question is whether German flexibility can adapt when it does. The Ardennes Passage, May 10th through 12th, tested logistics as much as combat capability. The forest roads that French planners considered impassable for armour proved passable but barely. Single-lane tracks wound through dense forest where a broken-down vehicle could block entire divisions. Hoth's traffic control officers performed brilliantly, routing units around obstacles, coordinating passage through bottlenecks. But the delays accumulated. A Panzer III through a track, blocking the route for 2 hours, until engineers pushed it into a ditch. A fuel truck crashed, requiring bomb disposal teams to clear spilled gasoline. Civilian refugees fleeing German advanced clogged roads until military police cleared them aside, creating humanitarian scenes that contrasted grimly with operational necessity. By May 12th evening, when forward elements reached the Meuse, Hoth's corps had taken 60 hours to cover 120 kilometres slow by breakthrough standards, but remarkable given terrain. May 13th, 0700 hours. The Meuse River at Dinant. Hoth observes from a forward command post as 7th Panzer Division begins its assault crossing. The river is 60 metres wide, flowing swiftly with spring runoff. French positions on the opposite bank include bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery registered on likely crossing sites. This is the critical moment. If the crossing fails, the entire operation stalls. Rommel's infantry begins crossing in rubber assault boats, paddling frantically while French machine guns churn water around them. Artillery fire from German positions suppresses some French bunkers, but not all. Boats overturn, men drown, but enough boats reach the far bank that infantry establish footholds. By noon, engineers are assembling pontoon bridges under fire. By 1600, the first Panzer EIs cross. By nightfall, Hoth has a full bridgehead, 3 kilometres deep. The cost? 5th Panzer Division loses 28 men killed, 70 wounded. 7th Panzer Division loses 93 killed, 200 wounded. Acceptable casualties for achieving breakthrough. The exploitation phase, May 14th through 16th, showcased German operational art at its peak. With Meux's bridgehead secured, Hoth ordered immediate exploitation westward. There was no pause to consolidate, no waiting for higher authorization. This was Auftragstaktik in action. Hoth understood the strategic objective, reached the channel, encircle Allied armies, and exercised initiative to achieve it. His two panzer divisions advanced on parallel axes, maintaining communication through radio nets that functioned remarkably well. Behind the tanks, motorized infantry secured occupied territory. Artillery moved inbounds, always within range to support lead elements. Luftwaffe liaison officers coordinated air support, directing Stuka strikes against French positions as German forces encountered them. The entire corps moved as an integrated organism, covering 50 to 60 kilometers daily. French response was confusion compounded by disbelief. Reports of German tanks appearing 30-40 kilometers behind defensive lines were dismissed as reconnaissance patrols or exaggerated sightings. French Ninth Army, defending the sector, Hoth penetrated, began disintegrating, units lost contact with headquarters, orders arrived hours late, and addressed situations that had changed. French tanks, technically superior to German models, were dispersed in small packets for infantry support rather than concentrated for counterattack. The Char B-1, with its thick armour and powerful 75mm gun, could destroy any German tank it encountered, but French Doctrine wasted this advantage. Individual Char B-1s fought bravely and were eventually surrounded or ran out of fuel because French logistics couldn't maintain mobile operations. German Doctrine wasn't superior because German equipment was better, it was superior because it integrated equipment, training, communications, and logistics into coherent operations. May 20th. 10 days into the campaign, Hoth's spearheads reached Abbeville on the English Channel, 240 kilometers from their Meuse bridgehead. In 10 days, XV Panzer Corps had penetrated deeper into enemy territory than German armies managed in 4 years during World War I. More importantly, the penetration achieved strategic effect. Allied forces in Belgium and northern France, over 1 million troops, were now cut off from supply and reinforcement. The campaign wasn't over, but its outcome was determined. France would fall. The question was, how quickly and at what cost? Hoth's corps had performed magnificently, 4% casualties, tactical objectives achieved ahead of schedule, sustained operational tempo despite logistics challenges. But Hoth himself was concerned about what came next. May 21st brought the crisis. British forces counterattacked at Arras, striking south with tank-heavy formations targeting Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. The attack achieved tactical surprise. British Matilda tanks, heavily armoured, shrugged off German anti-tank fire. German 37mm and 50mm guns couldn't penetrate Matilda frontal armour. SS infantry units, inadequately trained for anti-tank combat, broke under pressure. For several hours, the situation was genuinely dangerous. Rommel's division was overextended, its flanks exposed, vulnerable to being cut off. Hoth responded with characteristic, systematic approach. He redirected 5th Panzer Division elements to support Rommel's flank. He coordinated artillery concentration from multiple battalions. Most effectively, he ordered 88mm anti-aircraft guns into direct fire role, the only German weapons capable of reliably destroying Matildas. The crisis stabilised by late afternoon. British attack ran out of momentum, penetration was contained, situation restored. But Arras demonstrated what Hoth had warned about during planning exploitation: created vulnerability, especially when armour advanced ahead of infantry support. If British had committed more forces, if French had coordinated simultaneous counterattacks elsewhere, if German logistics had faltered at the wrong moment, the entire operation could have been endangered. Guderian's even more extended XIX Panzer Corps was potentially more vulnerable but never faced comparable counterattack. Luck played a role. German success in France owed as much to Allied incompetence and disorganisation as to German excellence. Hoth recognised this in his daily reports, warning against overconfidence, noting that stronger enemy with better coordination could exploit the vulnerabilities inherent in deep exploitation. The campaign's final phase saw Hoth's corps mopping up trapped Allied forces. The desperate evacuation at Dunkirk allowed 340,000 British and French troops to escape, but they left behind all heavy equipment. Paris fell on June 14th. French government requested armistice on June 17th. The surrender was signed June 22nd at Compiègne in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in November 1918. Hitler's theatrical revenge, total campaign duration 6 weeks. French casualties 360,000, including 1,900,000 captured German casualties, 49,000 killed, 111,000 wounded. The disparity was stunning. Germany had defeated what many considered the world's premier army at a cost rate of roughly 3-1. What made France 1940 a masterpiece wasn't just the victory, it was the method. German operational art in that campaign achieved what military theorists had sought since Napoleon: decisive victory through manoeuvre rather than attrition. The Wehrmacht demonstrated that properly employed mobile forces could penetrate, encircle, and defeat numerically superior enemies by creating operational paralysis. Hoth's contribution was making this doctrine sustainable. Where Guderian showed maximum exploitation potential, Hoth showed sustainable exploitation reality. His core maintained cohesion throughout the campaign, adapted to setbacks, balanced aggression with security. The contrasting approaches both succeeded. Suggesting German doctrine's strength was flexibility to apply different methods as situations required. But there was darkness beneath the triumph. Hoth's units, like all Wehrmacht formations, participated in or witnessed atrocities against civilians and prisoners. The clean military victory narrative concealed crimes that would later appear in trial transcripts. Hoth's command responsibility for actions by units under his control would be adjudicated in Nuremberg courtrooms years later. For now, in June 1940, he accepted congratulations and promotions, confident that professional military skill had achieved a great victory. The masterpiece was complete. It would also prove to be a misleading template. The Wehrmacht would try to replicate France's success in Russia and discover that operational brilliance had limits. Enemies learned from defeat, distances mattered. Resources were finite, and tactical perfection couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. The masterpiece of France would cast a shadow over everything that followed, creating false expectations that would lead to catastrophe. But in June 1940, as Hoth stood in conquered Paris, such concerns seemed impossibly distant. Germany had won, the method worked, and the future seemed limitless. June 25th, 1940, Compiègne, France. Hermann Hoth stands in formation with other senior commanders as Adolf Hitler accepts French surrender in the same railway carriage where Germany capitulated in 1918. The symbolism is precise and theatrical history reversed, humiliation avenged. Hoth watches Hitler's performance with professional detachment, recognizing propaganda but also understanding the strategic reality. Germany has achieved in 6 weeks what failed in 4 years during the previous war. The French army is destroyed, Britain isolated, and continental Europe dominated by German military power. This is the peak, though few recognize it. This moment represents the absolute apex of German armoured warfare, where doctrine, technology, and execution aligned perfectly to produce decisive results. Everything that follows will be descent from this high point, gradual or catastrophic, toward ultimate defeat. But in June 1940, defeat seems impossible, and German military art appears unstoppable. July 19th brought official recognition. Hitler promoted 12 generals to field marshal in a ceremony at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin. Hoth wasn't among them. His rank of General Oberst was high, but not the highest. However, he received the Knight's Cross and command of Panzer Group 3, a formation larger than a corps, essentially a small army. The promotion recognized his performance in France, where XV Corps had achieved objectives efficiently and sustainably. In the careful accounting Wehrmacht professionals conducted away from propaganda cameras, Hoth's methods had proven superior to more flamboyant approaches. His casualty rate was lower, his mechanical attrition better, his logistics more reliable. These weren't qualities that made good propaganda. There were no dramatic stories of personal courage or aggressive penetrations. But there were qualities that enabled sustained operations, and senior planners understood their value. August brought assignments that revealed both triumph and uncertainty. Hoth's new Panzer Group 3 began preparing for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. Staff officers studied coastal defences, tidal patterns, landing sites. Engineers designed specialised equipment for amphibious operations. infantry trained for assault landings. But the preparation felt hollow. Everyone involved recognized the massive challenges. The English Channel wasn't a river you could cross with rubber boats and pontoon bridges. It required naval superiority Germany didn't possess, and amphibious expertise Germany hadn't developed. The Luftwaffe's failure to defeat the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain made invasion even more problematic. By September, planning continued officially, while everyone privately understood Sea Lion would likely never execute. Hoth focused instead on maintaining unit readiness and absorbing replacement equipment and personnel. The statistical analysis of the French campaign, compiled by Wehrmacht operations staff, made sobering reading for those who looked beyond the victory narrative. Yes, Germany won decisively. But the victory cost 27,000 German dead and 160,000 wounded. Not catastrophic, but not negligible. Tank losses exceeded 800 vehicles from all causes, about 30% of deployed armour. The Luftwaffe lost 398 aircraft. France's defeat owed as much to French command dysfunction and poor coordination as to German excellence. French tanks were actually superior to German models. French artillery was excellent. France had more troops and stronger defences. Germany won through better doctrine, superior coordination, faster decision-making, and aggressive exploitation of opportunities. But these advantages were circumstantial, dependent on facing an enemy organised for the wrong war, led by commanders unprepared for mobile operations. International military attachés drew the wrong conclusions. British assessments in July 1940 predicted Britain had only months before German invasion. American military observers reported the Wehrmacht appeared invincible. These judgments missed critical limitations that Hoth and other professional German officers recognised. The mechanical breakdown rates during France remained unacceptably high. Over 40% of tanks required major repairs during the campaign. Logistics could barely sustain advances of 200 to 300 kilometres before operational pauses became necessary. The armoured force was small. Germany deployed only about 2,500 tanks. In France, barely 10% of the total army. The rest remained horse-drawn infantry divisions, moving at World War I pace. German military strength was concentrated in elite mechanized formations, while the bulk of the army remained obsolete. This created massive capability imbalance. Hoth's private correspondence from summer 1940 reveals his concerns. In letters to professional colleagues, he warned against overconfidence. France was not a template for future campaigns. It was a best-case scenario that likely wouldn't repeat. The next enemy might not be as vulnerable to mobile warfare. Distances might be greater, requiring even more complex logistics. Defenders might learn from French mistakes and develop effective countermeasures. His letters discussed technical improvements, needed better tank armour and armament to match or exceed enemy vehicles, improved mechanical reliability, expanded logistics capacity, enhanced winter equipment. These were the thoughts of a professional soldier thinking 3 moves ahead, not basking in current triumph. Few people wanted to hear such concerns when propaganda trumpeted German invincibility. September through December saw Panzer Group 3 conducting intensive training in occupied France and Poland. Hoth implemented lessons from the recent campaign, revised crossing procedures, improved tank infantry coordination drills, enhanced maintenance protocols. His units received upgraded equipment. Panzer III OSF-G and Panzer IV OSF-D, models with better armour and armament. Radio equipment improved, giving more reliable communication. Optical instruments, periscopes, binoculars, gun sights were refined. These incremental improvements accumulated into meaningful capability enhancement. Hoth also focused on human factors, rotating leave to keep soldiers fresh, conducting after-action discussions to institutionalize lessons, promoting junior officers who'd shown initiative under fire. Professional armies improved through systematic learning, and Hoth was making Panzer Group 3 better through detailed attention to every aspect of operations. Winter brought whispers about future operations, something being planned for the East, deployment schedules being developed, training areas being prepared. Officers were warned to maintain readiness for special deployment. No one officially mentioned Russia, but everyone understood. The Nazi-Soviet pact was obviously temporary. Hitler had always aimed to conquer Lebensraum in the East. The only questions were timing and scope. Hoth received preliminary orders to prepare Panzer Group 3 for extended operations in territory with poor roads and extreme weather. Staff officers began studying Russian geography, climate, infrastructure. The assignment filled Hoth with foreboding. France was 600 kilometers from German border to Atlantic coast. Russia was thousands of kilometers deep. France had modern roads and railways. Russia had primitive tracks and different railway gauge. France had temperate climate. Russia had brutal winters. The operational challenges would be exponentially greater, and the Wehrmacht wasn't prepared. The peak of summer 1940 represented something unique in military history, doctrine, and execution, in perfect alignment, producing seemingly impossible results. Hoth had been part of creating that doctrine, had commanded during its most successful application, had proven that mechanized warfare could achieve decisive strategic results. But peaks are, by definition, followed by descent. The Wehrmacht in summer 1940 was as capable as it would ever be. Experienced commanders, trained soldiers, working equipment, short supply lines, appropriate objectives. Everything that followed would degrade these advantages. Enemies would learn, distances would increase, logistics would strain, equipment would wear out. The German war economy couldn't sustain the force levels and technological advancement necessary to maintain superiority, and strategic objectives would exceed operational capability. Hoth understood this intellectually, though perhaps not emotionally. He'd spent a career studying military history, recognizing patterns, understanding limitations. Napoleon's Grand Army dominated Europe until it invaded Russia and was destroyed by logistics and winter. The German army of World War I achieved tactical excellence but couldn't overcome strategic encirclement and resource disadvantage. Now Hitler's Wehrmacht, having conquered France, was preparing to invade Russia while still at war with Britain. The strategic situation was deteriorating even as tactical capabilities peaked. Hoth could see the contradictions but couldn't resolve them. He was a corps commander, not a national strategist. His responsibility was preparing his units for whatever mission they received. If that mission was invading Russia, he would execute it with maximum professional competence. But he harbored no illusions about the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Summer 1940 was the peak, autumn would bring descent, and winter would bring catastrophe that no amount of tactical skill could avert. December 18th, 1940, Zossen, Germany. Hermann Hoth sits in a briefing room deep inside Wehrmacht High Command headquarters, looking at maps that make his stomach clench. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, is being presented by staff officers who've never commanded troops in combat. The maps show German forces advancing from the Polish border to objectives 1,600 kilometers distant, Leningrad, Moscow, the Caucasus. The timeline shows these objectives being achieved in 8 to 12 weeks. The logistics estimates assume minimal resistance after initial border battles. Hoth has commanded at every level from platoon to Panzer Group, has studied warfare for 35 years, and he knows immediately that this plan violates every principle of operational art. You cannot advance 1,600 kilometers without pausing for logistics. You cannot conquer a nation of 200 million people in 12 weeks. You cannot assume an enemy will collapse just because you want them to. But when he raises objections, he's dismissed as overly cautious. Haven't we just conquered France in 6 weeks? Isn't German doctrine superior? Hoth leaves the briefing with a sense of foreboding that will prove entirely justified. The fundamental error was applying the France template to an entirely different problem. France was 600 kilometers deep with excellent roads, modern railways, and a government that could be decapitated to force surrender. Russia was thousands of kilometers deep with primitive roads, incompatible railways, and a totalitarian government that could trade space for time indefinitely. France had 40 million people concentrated in defendable territory. The Soviet Union had 200 million spread across 11 time zones. The Wehrmacht had barely sufficient logistics to sustain 6 weeks of operations in France. Planners were now assuming the same logistics could support months of operations across distances 3 times greater. It was fantasy, but fantasy supported by victory disease, the belief that recent success guaranteed future success regardless of changed circumstances. February 1941 brought Hoth to detailed planning sessions where the contradictions became glaring. German intelligence estimated Soviet strength at 150 divisions. The actual number was over 300, but even the underestimate created problems. To encircle and destroy 150 divisions required enormous German forces operating across vast frontiers. The plan divided German forces into 3 army groups: North Objective, Leningrad, Center, South Ukraine, and Caucasus. This immediately created strategic confusion, which objective was paramount. Hitler vacillated, sometimes emphasizing economic targets like Ukrainian agriculture and Caucasian oil, sometimes insisting Moscow's capture would collapse Soviet resistance. The divided focus meant German forces would be strong nowhere and vulnerable everywhere. Hoth's Panzer Group 3 was assigned to Army Group Center, tasked with advancing from East Prussia through Lithuania and Belarus toward Moscow. His briefing materials outlined first phase objectives: Minsk, 300 kilometers, then Smolensk, 600 kilometers, then Moscow, 800 kilometers total. The plan allowed minimal pauses for logistics or maintenance. When Hoth questioned this, staff officers explained that captured Soviet supplies would sustain the advance. This assumption revealed stunning ignorance of reality. Soviet railways used different gauge 1,520mm compared to German 1,435. Every kilometre of captured railway would require regauging before German trains could use it. Soviet vehicles used different fuel and parts than German equipment. Soviet supply dumps would be destroyed or evacuated before capture. The plan assumed perfect conditions that were fantastically unlikely. March brought Hoth to a particularly troubling briefing about Soviet military capability. Wehrmacht intelligence characterized Soviet forces as inferior, poorly led, inadequately trained, equipped with obsolete weapons. Some of this was accurate. Stalin's purges had killed thousands of experienced officers. Soviet military doctrine in 1941 was confused and defensive, but intelligence also revealed concerning data being ignored. The Soviets had developed the 34 tank, which outperformed any German armour in firepower, armour, and mobility. Soviet artillery was numerically superior. The Red Army could sustain staggering casualties and continue fighting Soviet culture, and totalitarian control enabled sacrifices Germany couldn't match. When Hoth raised these concerns, he was told not to worry, German tactical superiority would overcome Soviet material advantages. April's delay of Barbarossa from mid-May to late June, caused by German intervention in Yugoslavia and Greece, shortened the campaigning season by 5 crucial weeks. Hoth understood immediately that this was catastrophic. Russian winter came early snow, typically arrived in October. Losing 5 weeks of summer meant German forces would hit winter weather before reaching objectives. He submitted formal objections, noting that Moscow was 800 kilometers from the start line, requiring 4 to 5 months to reach, even with perfect conditions. Starting in late June meant reaching Moscow in November at earliest, exactly when winter weather would make operations impossible. His objections were noted and ignored. The political necessity of securing Germany's southern flank before invading Russia overrode operational considerations. Strategy was being dictated by Hitler's impulses rather than military logic. May 1941 saw Hoth's Panzer Group 3 completing final preparations. The force now included 4 motorized corps with 840 tanks plus supporting infantry, artillery, and logistics. It was the largest formation Hoth had ever commanded, representing enormous striking power. But he was painfully aware of its limitations. His planning staff calculated that the Panzer Group consumed 2,000 tons of supplies daily: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food. At 800 kilometers depth, each truck making a supply run from railheads would take 6 to 8 days round trip. The Germans would need thousands of trucks operating flawlessly to sustain operations. Yet truck reliability was poor, and Soviet roads were worse than French. Hoth submitted a request for a 6-week operational pause after advancing 600 kilometers to allow logistics to catch up and rebuild mechanical readiness. The request was denied. June 20th brought final briefings 48 hours before hour. Hoth gathered his division commanders and laid out the operational concept with characteristic thoroughness. Panzer Group 3 would advance northeast from East Prussia, penetrating Soviet border defences, encircling Soviet forces in Lithuania and Belarus, driving toward the Dvina River and beyond toward Moscow. Speed was essential. Maintain 30 to 40 kilometers daily advance. Don't get bogged down in positional fighting. Bypass strong points for following infantry to reduce. The briefing was professional and detailed, but Hoth added a warning that wasn't in official plans. Soviet forces would probably fight harder than France, distances were vast, logistics would be challenging. Officers should expect a long campaign, possibly extending into winter. Prepare psychologically for sustained operations under difficult conditions. Some commanders seemed surprised by the cautionary tone. Hadn't they just conquered France easily? The contrast between German and Soviet preparations was complex. Soviet forces significantly outnumbered Germans, 3 million plus Germans invading against 5 million Soviet troops in Western USSR. The Soviets had more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, but Soviet forces were poorly deployed, concentrated on borders rather than in strategic depth. Soviet command was paralyzed by Stalin's refusal to believe invasion was imminent, despite overwhelming intelligence. Soviet military doctrine was confused, recent reorganizations had disrupted command structures. Most importantly, Soviet tactical competence in 1941 was inferior to German. Individual Soviet soldiers were tough and brave, but coordination and initiative were weak. The Wehrmacht was betting that tactical superiority could overcome strategic disadvantage, the gambler's fallacy. That skill at the table ensures winning even when the house has statistical advantage. June 21st, evening. Hoth made final rounds of his forward units, visiting tank crews, talking with soldiers, checking equipment. The mood was confident. These were veterans of Poland and France, experienced professionals who trusted their training and leadership. Few understood the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Hoth didn't share his deepest concerns with enlisted soldiers. That wasn't the role of commanders. But he was profoundly worried. Everything about Barbarossa violated principles he'd spent a career learning. The objectives were too distant. The timeline was too optimistic. The logistics were inadequate. The enemy was underestimated. The strategic confusion about priorities guaranteed problems. This operation was being launched because Hitler willed it, not because military logic supported it. Hoth was a professional soldier in a totalitarian system, obligated to execute orders regardless of private judgment. At 03:15 the next morning, Barbarossa would begin. Hoth would command brilliantly, would achieve tactical successes, would demonstrate that German operational art remained superior. But tactics couldn't overcome strategy, and the strategy was fundamentally flawed. The gambler's fallacy was betting everything on one hand, assuming previous wins guaranteed future success. Germany was about to discover that in the longest of wars, the house always wins. And Hermann Hoth, master of armoured warfare, would be present for the education brutal, costly, ultimately catastrophic, that destroyed the Wehrmacht and transformed triumph into tragedy. June 22nd, 1941, 03:15, Soviet frontier. The largest invasion in human history begins with artillery barrage from 3,000 German guns. Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3 crosses from East Prussia into Lithuania as part of Army Group Center's massive assault. In the first hours, everything seems to validate German confidence. Soviet border defences are overrun, thousands of prisoners taken, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. By midday, Hoth's lead elements have penetrated 40 kilometres. By evening, 60 kilometres. The advance is faster than Poland, matching France. Soviet forces appeared disorganised and confused, retreating or surrendering. But Hoth notices details that trouble him. Isolated Soviet units fighting to encirclement rather than surrendering. The appearance of 34 and KV-1 tanks that his guns can barely damage. The vast distances between objectives. This isn't France. The enemy isn't collapsing. And 800 kilometres to Moscow suddenly seems very, very far. The first week of Barbarossa showcased both German operational excellence and the emergence of problems that would prove catastrophic. Hoth's Panzer Group 3, coordinating with Guderian's Panzer Group 2, attacking from the south, encircled massive Soviet forces in the Bialystok-Minsk pocket. By June 30th, 300,000 Soviet troops were trapped, an encirclement larger than anything achieved in France. But eliminating the pocket took 2 weeks because trapped Soviet units fought ferociously. German infantry divisions following the Panzers had to conduct sustained combat to reduce the pocket rather than the rapid mop-up operations Poland and France had seen. This created the first major dilemma: should panzer groups wait for infantry to finish or continue advancing? Hoth argued for pause to consolidate and resupply. Guderian demanded immediate, continued advance. High Command sided with Guderian. The Panzers rolled east, while Soviet forces remained active in German rear areas. June 27th brought Hoth's first encounter with Soviet heavy tanks that would haunt German operations throughout the war. Near Reassignment, Lithuania, a single WW2 heavy tank blocked a crucial crossroad for 24 hours. German 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate its armour. 50mm guns barely scratched it. The tank destroyed 12 German vehicles before eventually being destroyed by engineers placing explosives directly on the hull. The incident was operationally minor but psychologically significant. German soldiers discovered they faced enemy equipment superior to their own. The KV-1 and 34 tanks had better armour, better guns, and better mobility than Panzer III and IV. German tactical doctrine and crew training remained superior, but the equipment disadvantage was real and growing. July 10th marked the completion of the first major encirclement phase, Smolensk pocket. Hoth's and Guderian's panzer groups met east of the city, trapping another 300,000 Soviet troops. In 18 days, Army Group Center had advanced 400 kilometers and encircled over 600,000 enemy soldiers. By France's standards, the campaign was essentially one such losses should collapse enemy resistance. But Soviet forces continued fighting. New divisions appeared from eastern USSR. Casualties were replaced. Stalin's regime showed no inclination to surrender. And German forces were beginning to suffer serious attrition. Hoth's Panzer Group 3 had lost 30% of its tanks, 150 vehicles to combat, 200 to mechanical failure. That was 60% of total losses being self-inflicted through breakdown rather than enemy action. The Smolensk battle, July through August, revealed the fundamental unsustainability of German operations. Hoth's units were now 700 kilometers from their start line and 400 kilometers from the nearest functioning railroad. Supplying combat operations required truck convoys that took 8 to 10 days round trip. Soviet roads, which German planners had optimistically assumed were adequate, proved to be dirt tracks that dissolved into mud after any rain. Fuel consumption exceeded planning estimates because vehicles had to use low gears constantly on poor roads. Spare parts were unavailable because supply priority went to ammunition and fuel. Hoth's maintenance crews worked 20-hour days but fell further behind. The rate of mechanical failure exceeded repair capacity. By August 1st, Panzer Group 3 had only 420 operational tanks, despite having started with 840. The deficit wasn't enemy action, it was logistics and maintenance collapse. August brought the catastrophic strategic decision that likely saved Moscow. Hitler ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance on the Soviet capital and divert forces to support operations in Ukraine and Leningrad. Hoth's Panzer Group 3 was to assist in capturing Leningrad, while Guderian's Panzer Group 2 went south to Ukraine. The decision was strategically incoherent. Moscow was only 250 kilometers distant. Soviet defenses before the capital were depleting, and capturing Moscow might collapse Soviet resistance. But Hitler prioritized economic objectives: Ukrainian agriculture, Leningrad's symbolic importance over the military objective of destroying Soviet armed forces. Hoth received orders and complied, though he privately believed the decision would extend the war by years. September and October saw Hoth's forces engaged in grinding combat around Leningrad that consumed men and material for minimal gain. The city was encircled but not captured, Soviet defenders fought tenaciously, and urban warfare negated German mobility advantages. Meanwhile, Hoth's logistical situation deteriorated further. His units were 800 kilometers from functioning railheads, operating in terrain increasingly dominated by forests and swamps where tanks had limited utility. Casualties accumulated, not dramatic battles, but steady attrition of combat deaths, wounded, and illness. Replacements didn't fully offset losses. Equipment wore out faster than it could be maintained. By October, Panzer Group 3 was at 40% of June strength in effective combat power. November brought orders that filled Hoth with dread. Panzer Group 3 was redesignated 3rd Panzer Army and ordered to participate in renewed offensive toward Moscow. Operation Typhoon was Hitler's attempt to capture the Soviet capital before winter. The offensive began October 2nd, achieved initial successes, encircled another 600,000 Soviet troops at Vyazma. But now, German forces faced the cumulative attrition of 4 months' operations. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army had less than 300 operational tanks. His infantry divisions were at 50% strength. His logistics were catastrophic. Fuel shortages forced multi-day operational pauses, ammunition was rationed, food supplies were inadequate, and crucially, winter clothing hadn't been issued because German planning assumed victory before winter. November 15th marked the final German push toward Moscow. Hoth's units reached Klin, 65 kilometers from the capital. Through binoculars, forward observers could see the spires of the Kremlin. This was the high water mark. And then winter struck with full force. Temperatures dropped to -20 Celsius, then -30, then -40. German equipment failed catastrophically. Tank engines wouldn't start without fires lit underneath them. Machine guns froze. Vehicles broke down. And, worst of all, soldiers suffered mass frostbite because they lacked proper winter gear. The Wehrmacht had conquered France wearing light summer uniforms. Now those same soldiers were fighting at temperatures 30 degrees below freezing in the same uniforms. Thousands suffered frostbite injuries. Morale collapsed as men realized their leadership had failed them. December 5th brought catastrophe. Massive Soviet counteroffensive using fresh Siberian divisions equipped for winter warfare. Soviet forces outnumbered Germans 3-1 in critical sectors, attacking with troops dressed in winter clothing, equipped with equipment that functioned in extreme cold, supported by artillery and tanks prepared for winter operations. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army, overstretched and under strength, faced encirclement. The Klin-Kalinin sector, where his units operated, became a nightmare of desperate defensive fighting. German forces, which had advanced 800 kilometers in 6 months, were thrown back 150 kilometers in 2 weeks, the largest German retreat of the war to that point. Units lost coherence. Casualties mounted horrifically, 40,000 men in 3rd Panzer Army alone, 35% of its strength. Tank losses exceeded 80% through combination of combat, mechanical failure, and abandonment when fuel ran out. December 19th brought Hitler's notorious no-retreat order. All units must hold their positions regardless of tactical situation. The order was militarily insane, guaranteeing encirclement and destruction of exposed units. But it also prevented complete collapse. Some historians argue that absent the order, the entire Eastern Front might have disintegrated. Hoth obeyed, holding positions that should have been abandoned, sacrificing units to maintain coherent defensive line. His soldiers fought with remarkable courage under impossible conditions, freezing, starving, outnumbered, but maintaining discipline and cohesion even in retreat. The professionalism that Hoth had cultivated through training now manifested in soldiers' refusal to break despite every reason to do so. The winter of 1941 shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility and revealed Operation Barbarossa's fundamental flaw: brilliant tactics couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. German forces had encircled millions of Soviet soldiers, penetrated hundreds of kilometers, demonstrated operational superiority in every major battle. But they hadn't defeated the Soviet Union. The distances were too vast, the population too numerous, the regime too ruthless, and German logistics too inadequate. Hoth had commanded brilliantly, had achieved every tactical objective, had proven himself a master of armoured warfare. But mastery meant nothing when the strategic premises were false. By December 31st, 1941, 3rd Panzer Army had suffered casualties equal to 50% of its June strength. It held positions 300 kilometers west of Moscow, having retreated from the gates of the capital. The abyss of Eastern Front warfare had opened. And Hermann Hoth was about to learn that the descent had only begun. Ahead lay Stalingrad, Kursk, and, ultimately, defeat. But in December 1941, frozen soldiers simply struggled to survive one more day in the catastrophe their leadership had created. The gambler's fallacy had produced its inevitable result. And the cost would be measured in millions of lives. December 5th 1941, Klin, Soviet Union, temperature -35 Celsius. Hermann Hoth stands in a frozen command post that was supposed to be abandoned yesterday, but can't be because Hitler has ordered no retreat. Through the frosted window, he watches Soviet artillery pound German positions that have become death traps. His 3rd Panzer Army, which 6 months ago had 840 tanks and seemed invincible, now has fewer than 100 operational vehicles and is fighting for survival. Fresh Siberian divisions are attacking all along his front, troops equipped with winter clothing, vehicles winterized with proper lubricants, weapons that function in extreme cold. His own soldiers are freezing to death in their positions, wearing summer uniforms because someone in Berlin decided the war would end before winter. Machine guns jam after 3 rounds because the oil freezes. Tank engines won't start, men lose fingers and toes to frostbite, and the Soviets keep coming, wave after wave, accepting casualties that would shatter any Western army but barely slowing their offensive momentum. The Soviet counteroffensive beginning December 5th was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had faced. This wasn't disorganized resistance or desperate defense, this was coordinated, multi-front offensive by an enemy the Germans thought was beaten. Soviet planners had husbanded fresh divisions from Siberia and Central Asia, waiting for German exhaustion before committing them. Now they struck with overwhelming force at multiple points simultaneously. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army sector faced 3 Soviet armies: 1st Shock Army, 30th Army, and 20th Army, totaling over 300,000 troops. Against them, Hoth had roughly 90,000 effectives, and effective was generous given their condition. His front stretched 120 kilometers, meaning he averaged less than 1,000 troops per kilometer. Soviet doctrine emphasized breakthrough by concentration. They massed forces 4 or 5 to 1 at breakthrough points, achieving local superiority that shattered German lines. The mathematics of winter warfare were brutal and unforgiving. At -35 Celsius, human beings can survive perhaps 2 hours of exposure before hypothermia becomes life-threatening. German soldiers, lacking proper winter clothing, couldn't remain in fighting positions for even that long. They rotated into dugouts and bunkers every hour, but the bunkers were only marginally warmer. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. Men lost toes, feet, fingers, hands, noses, ears to freezing. The medical evacuation system, already strained by combat wounded, couldn't handle the flood of cold injuries. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Soldiers with frostbite too severe to walk but not severe enough to justify evacuation remained in combat positions. Effectiveness degraded but still counted as effective strength in reports to High Command. December 15th marked the crisis point. Soviet forces broke through 3rd Panzer Army lines at multiple locations, creating penetrations 5 to 10 kilometers deep. Hoth's reserves, already committed elsewhere, couldn't contain the breakthroughs. He requested permission to conduct fighting retreat to defensible positions on the Lama River, 50 kilometers west. Hitler's headquarters denied the request, reiterating the no-retreat order. So Hoth improvised, conducting unauthorized adjustments where units retreated at night and established new positions without officially acknowledging withdrawal. It was institutional dishonesty forced by Hitler's tactical micromanagement commanders doing what military necessity required while maintaining the fiction of obeying orders. The strain on Hoth was immense. He was caught between responsibility to his soldiers and duty to obey commands, choosing soldier welfare while risking court-martial. The equipment failures went beyond just cold weather effects. German vehicles and weapons were designed for Central European conditions, not Arctic warfare. Tank transmissions used lubricants that solidified at -20, engine blocks cracked when coolant froze, rubber components, tracks, hoses, seals became brittle and shattered. Optical instruments fogged and froze. Even successfully started tanks could only operate for short periods before overheating, because cold-thickened lubricants created excessive friction. Soviet equipment suffered similar problems, but less severely. Soviet engineers had designed for cold climate, and Soviet logistics provided winterization kits. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, already collapsed under distance and poor roads, couldn't distribute winterization materials even when they existed. Hoth's maintenance officers performed miracles keeping any vehicles operational, but they were fighting physics with inadequate tools. December 21st, winter solstice, shortest day of the year. Hoth's defensive line had been pushed back 80 kilometers in 16 days. The retreat was orderly but costly. Rearguard actions, abandoned equipment, field hospitals evacuated under fire. The 3rd Panzer Army was maintaining coherence but bleeding strength daily. Casualty reports made grim reading. 250 killed, 800 wounded, 200 missing, 400 frostbite casualties every single day, week after week. At that attrition rate, the army would cease to exist by February. Replacements were arriving, small groups of poorly trained recruits, shocked by the conditions, inadequately equipped. They died faster than veterans because they lacked skills to survive. The Wehrmacht was consuming its human capital at unsustainable rates. The Soviet offensive wasn't just frontal pressure, it employed sophisticated operational maneuver. Soviet cavalry and ski troops infiltrated through forests, attacking German rear areas and supply lines. These raids created paranoia. German units never knew if their supply routes were secure, if their flanks were protected, if enemy forces were behind them. Hoth had to divert combat troops to rear area security, further weakening his front lines. Soviet partisans, emboldened by the counteroffensive, increased attacks on German logistics. The Wehrmacht found itself fighting a multi-dimensional battle: frontal combat against Soviet regular forces, rear area security against partisans and raiders, battle against weather and equipment failure, struggle to maintain logistics across deteriorating supply lines. No army can succeed when fighting on so many fronts simultaneously. January 1942 brought slight stabilization as German lines shortened and Soviet offensive momentum declined. The Soviets had advanced 100 to 150 kilometers, liberating territory but not achieving breakthrough to operational depth. Their casualties were staggering. Soviet offensive doctrine accepted losses Western armies would consider catastrophic. Stalin's regime could sustain such losses through totalitarian control and massive population. Germany could not. By late January, both sides approached exhaustion. Soviet advances slowed. German retreats stabilized. A ragged front line formed roughly 200 kilometers west of Moscow, where both armies dug in for the remainder of winter. The human cost for 3rd Panzer Army was devastating. From December 5th through January 31st, Hoth's units suffered 43,000 casualties: killed, wounded, missing, and frostbite. That represented 45% of the army's June strength. Tank strength had collapsed from 840 to fewer than 80 operational vehicles, 90% losses. Artillery was similarly depleted. Infantry divisions that began Barbarossa with 18,000 men now fielded 6,000. The 3rd Panzer Army still existed as an organizational entity, still held defensive positions, still executed orders, but it was a shell. Combat effectiveness reduced by 3/4, sustained only by soldiers' professionalism and Hoth's competent leadership. The winter crisis revealed something about Hoth's character that had been less visible during the triumphant advances. He was at his best in adversity. During the France campaign, when everything went well, his methodical approach seemed almost pedestrian compared to more flamboyant commanders. But in crisis, when the situation was desperate and errors meant death, Hoth's systematic competence became invaluable. He maintained command and control when other sectors collapsed into chaos. He allocated resources rationally when panic suggested hoarding. He kept his headquarters informed of actual conditions rather than sending optimistic fiction. He visited frontline units constantly, showing soldiers that leadership shared their suffering. His staff officers noted that Herr General seemed calmer in December than he'd been in July. Crisis focused his mind. The strategic implications of winter 1941 were profound but not yet fully understood. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated it could not conquer the Soviet Union through rapid offensive. The Red Army had demonstrated it could absorb catastrophic losses and counterattack effectively. Germany now faced exactly what Hitler had tried to avoid: prolonged multi-front war against enemies with superior resources. The Eastern Front had stabilized but hadn't ended. Millions of German soldiers were now committed to holding Soviet territory, unable to advance but unable to withdraw. The initiative had shifted. Germany was no longer dictating the war's course but reacting to enemy action. For Hoth personally, the winter meant realization that tactical brilliance had limits. He'd commanded, as well as humanly possible, made optimal decisions given impossible constraints, demonstrated mastery of operational arts. and he'd still been forced into costly retreat because the strategic situation was untenable. February brought bitter cold that paradoxically helped German defence. Soviet offensives slowed as even they struggled with -40 temperatures. Hoth used the pause to rebuild 3rd Panzer Army. Replacements arrived, men and equipment, never enough, but better than nothing. Damaged vehicles were repaired, supply lines improved marginally as German engineers regauged railway lines. Winter clothing finally reached frontline units, months too late but still welcome. Training programs started for replacement troops. Hoth personally developed defensive doctrine for static winter warfare, something German army had never planned for but now needed desperately. The army that had specialised in mobile offensive warfare was learning to defend frozen trenches. It was professional adaptation, but adaptation to circumstances that represented strategic failure. March 1942 saw spring thaw approaching. The Rasputitsa mud season would soon make all movement impossible for 6 to 8 weeks. Hoth received preliminary orders for summer operations. 3rd Panzer Army would transfer south to participate in offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The winter had been survived, barely, at terrible cost. Over 800,000 German casualties on the Eastern Front between June and March, 1/4 of the invasion force. The Wehrmacht remained the world's most tactically proficient army. German commanders like Hoth still demonstrated operational excellence. But excellence was being ground down through attrition that couldn't be replaced. The Winter of Wolves had taught hard lessons about limits of military skill. Ahead lay summer campaigns that would test those limits even further, driving towards Stalingrad, and a catastrophe that would dwarf the winter crisis. But in March 1942, frozen, soldiers simply welcomed warmer weather and tried not to think about what summer would bring. They'd survived winter. That victory was enough for now. May 1st, 1942, southern Russia. Hermann Hoth assumes command of 4th Panzer Army, his 3rd major command in 3 years of war. The assignment represents both recognition of competence and strategic desperation. The Wehrmacht needs experienced commanders for another summer offensive, and Hoth has proven he can manage difficult operations. His new command is being rebuilt from units that survived winter fighting, reinforced with fresh divisions from Germany and upgraded equipment. The 4th Panzer Army exists more on paper than in reality. 450 tanks, 3 motorised divisions, supporting units. It's powerful, but a shadow of what Panzer Group 3 had been in June 1941. Hoth inspects his units and sees faces younger than before. The replacements are boys, 18 and 19 years. Old, inadequately trained, rushed to the front because German manpower reserves are depleting. The veterans who survive winter have a haunted quality, eyes that have seen too much. This army can still fight, but it's fragile in ways that statistics don't capture. The strategic situation in spring 1942 was simultaneously better and worse than a year earlier. Better because the Wehrmacht had survived winter, stabilised the front, maintained control of occupied territory. Soviet offensives had been contained without producing German collapse. Worse, because Germany now faced sustained multi-front war with finite resources against enemies whose resources were growing. Soviet war production was accelerating. Factories evacuated east were producing tanks and artillery beyond German estimates. American entry into the war meant Allied strength would increase exponentially over time. Germany's window for achieving victory was closing, yet Hitler was planning another massive offensive case blue, the drive to capture Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad. Hoth spent May rebuilding 4th Panzer Army through intensive training. His approach emphasized realistic preparation, no propaganda about German superiority, no assumptions about enemy collapse. He told his officers bluntly that they faced a competent enemy capable of sustained resistance, that operations would be harder than Poland or France, that logistics and maintenance would be critical. His training exercises simulated extended operations, multi-day advances, coordination under stress. He personally evaluated junior officers, promoting those who showed initiative and relieving those who couldn't adapt. The Wehrmacht was still a learning institution, still capable of improvement. But improvements were incremental, while the challenges were growing exponentially. The technological evolution in German armour represented genuine progress. The Panzer IV Auswerf II, entering service in spring 1942, mounted the long 75mm L-43 gun, capable of defeating Soviet 34 tanks at combat ranges. This was the first German tank that could reliably fight Soviet medium armor on equal terms. Hoth watched gunnery trials where Panzer IV F2S engaged target tanks at 1,200 meters, engagements that would have been impossible with earlier German guns. He also saw the new heavy tanks, the Tiger I, mounting the 88mm gun that had proven effective against Soviet heavies when used in anti-aircraft role. Only a handful of Tigers existed, they were mechanically unreliable, and they consumed fuel at rates that strained logistics. But they represented German attempt to match Soviet heavy armor. June brought detailed briefings on Case Blue operational plans. The offensive would strike from Kursk area southward toward Voronezh, then turn southeast down the Don River Valley towards Stalingrad, then south into the Caucasus. It was extraordinarily ambitious. Over 1,000 kilometers of advance across terrain Germans hadn't reconnoitred, against enemy forces that had 6 months to prepare defences. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army would provide mobile striking power, exploiting breakthroughs and encircling Soviet forces. The plan assumed again that initial victories would lead to Soviet collapse. Hoth had heard these assumptions before Barbarossa and watched them prove false. He submitted memoranda questioning the objective scope, the logistics requirements, the assumption of enemy collapse. His concerns were noted and ignored. June 28, 1942. Case Blue began with attacks by German and Romanian forces toward Voronezh. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army wasn't initially committed. The plan called for staggered deployment, with Hoth's forces entering battle after initial breakthroughs were achieved. This violated Hoth's understanding of armoured warfare. You commit mobile forces early to create breakthrough, not after breakthrough is achieved by slower infantry. But the plan was Hitler's. And Hitler was increasingly making tactical decisions that should have been left to field commanders. Hoth waited in reserve while other forces fought, frustrated by the inefficient sequencing. July 2nd brought Hoth's entry into the battle. 4th Panzer Army drove southeast toward Voronezh, reaching the Don River and establishing bridgeheads. The advance was successful but not decisive. Soviet forces retreated in relatively good order, avoiding encirclement. Unlike Barbarossa's opening weeks, where huge pockets of Soviet troops were trapped, Case Blue was producing modest tactical gains without strategic breakthrough. The Soviets had learned they traded space for time, avoided encirclement, retreated before German pincers closed. German forces advanced but captured fewer prisoners and destroyed fewer enemy units than operations required. Victory was being measured in kilometres gained rather than enemy forces destroyed. July 13th brought the catastrophic strategic decision that would doom Stalingrad. Hitler ordered 4th Panzer Army to turn south, away from Stalingrad, to assist 1st Panzer Army in capturing Rostov and crossing into the Caucasus. This divided German forces between two diverging axes, 6th Army advancing on Stalingrad alone while 4th Panzer Army went south. The division violated basic principles of concentration of force. Hoth protested through proper channels, arguing that Stalingrad should be taken quickly by concentrated forces or bypassed entirely. His protests were rejected. 4th Panzer Army turned south, crossed the Don, advanced toward Rostov. The capture of Rostov was achieved, but meanwhile 6th Army's advance on Stalingrad slowed as resistance stiffened without armoured support. July 23rd brought another reversal. 4th Panzer Army was ordered to turn north and support 6th Army's assault on Stalingrad after all. Hoth's units executed a countermarch, returning north across Don, moving to Stalingrad's southern approaches. The back-and-forth manoeuvring consumed time, fuel, and mechanical reliability while achieving nothing. Tank units that had already covered hundreds of kilometres were being marched additional distances because Hitler couldn't decide on priorities. Hoth's operations staff calculated that 4th Panzer Army had travelled over 1,200 kilometres since Case Blue began, much of that lateral movement rather than advance toward objectives. The indecision was grinding down the force before serious fighting even began. August brought 4th Panzer Army to Stalingrad's southern approaches. The city sprawled along the Volga River's west bank, a major industrial centre, important transportation hub, and symbolically significant because it bore Stalin's name. Hitler had become obsessed with capturing Stalingrad, elevating what should have been an operational objective into a political imperative. Hoth's assignment was to attack northward toward the city while 6th Army attacked from the west. The plan was sound, a pincer attack to encircle Soviet defenders. But execution revealed problems. Urban warfare negated German mobile warfare advantages. Tanks were vulnerable in city streets. Infantry combat became building-to-building fighting where tactical skill mattered more than operational art. And Soviet resistance was intensifying rather than collapsing. August 23rd marked 4th Panzer Army's furthest advanced elements reached the Volga River south of Stalingrad, temporarily cutting Soviet communications. But the achievement couldn't be exploited. Soviet reinforcements poured across the Volga into Stalingrad, turning the city into a fortress. 6th Army, attacking from west, was drawn into grinding urban combat. 4th Panzer Army, which should have been exploiting an open terrain, was instead supporting siege operations. Hoth protested the mission change mobile forces were being wasted in positional warfare they weren't designed for. But Stalingrad had become Hitler's obsession. The city must be captured regardless of operational logic. September through October saw 4th Panzer Army stuck in supporting role, while 6th Army fought in Stalingrad's ruins. Hoth's tanks and motorized infantry provided flank security, fought defensive battles against Soviet counterattacks, supported 6th Army's attacks missions that absorbed strength without achieving strategic objectives. The 4th Panzer Army was being ground down through attrition, losing men and equipment in small-scale actions that didn't appear in dramatic battle reports but cumulatively destroyed combat power. By November, the army had lost 30% of its tanks and 25% of its infantry to casualties and mechanical breakdown. And then Soviet intelligence detected something ominous: massive Soviet forces massing north and south of Stalingrad, facing the weak Romanian armies protecting German flanks. November 19th, 1942, 0730, Operation Uranus Soviet counteroffensive struck with overwhelming force against Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies on Stalingrad's flanks. The Romanians, equipped with obsolete weapons and inadequately supported, collapsed within hours. Soviet tank columns poured through breakthroughs, driving for link-up east of Stalingrad to encircle 6th Army. Hoth recognized immediately what was happening: a massive encirclement operation using German tactics against German forces. He ordered 4th Panzer Army to retreat southwest, avoiding encirclement. His rapid response saved his command. 4th Panzer Army escaped the pocket, but 6th Army, locked in Stalingrad, street fighting, was too slow to react. By November 23rd, when Soviet pincers met at Kalach, 250,000 German and Axis troops were trapped in Stalingrad pocket, and 4th Panzer Army, positioned southwest of the encirclement, was the only mobile force available for rescue operations. The phoenix from ashes that 4th Panzer Army represented in May, rebuilt, re-equipped, restored, was now being asked to perform a miracle. Hoth had spent 6 months preparing this force, training it, preserving it through difficult operations. Now he would have to risk everything in a relief operation with minimal chance of success. The rebirth had been real. 4th Panzer Army was competent, experienced, reasonably well equipped. But competence couldn't overcome the strategic disaster unfolding at Stalingrad. The summer had burned away German strength in pursuit of objectives that were simultaneously too ambitious and not ambitious enough, too ambitious to achieve with available forces, not ambitious enough to justify the costs being incurred. Hoth had commanded as well as possible given impossible constraints, and now he faced the ultimate impossible: constraint rescue, a trapped army against overwhelming enemy strength, with inadequate forces and winter approaching. The phoenix would have to fly into fire, and this time there would be no rebirth from the ashes. August 23rd, 1942, Stalingrad southern approaches. Hermann Hoth watches through binoculars as lead elements of 4th Panzer Army reach the Volga River, briefly cutting Soviet communications into Stalingrad. It should be a moment of triumph. German forces have advanced over 200 kilometers in 3 weeks, outmaneuvered Soviet defenses, achieved tactical objectives. But Hoth feels only foreboding. Through those same binoculars, he can see Soviet reinforcements crossing the Volga on barges and boats, flowing into Stalingrad's ruins in endless streams. The city that was supposed to fall quickly is becoming a fortress. 6th Army, attacking from the west, reports that every building requires combat to capture that. Soviet resistance intensifies, rather than weakens. 4th Panzer Army, designed for mobile warfare, is being drawn into static urban combat where tanks are vulnerable and mobility is irrelevant. The operational objective, Stalingrad, is becoming an obsession that consumes forces without producing strategic results. Hoth understands immediately that this is a trap, but understanding doesn't provide escape. The transformation of Stalingrad from operational objective to symbolic obsession happened gradually through August and September. Initially, the city was simply another target in Case Blue's sequence: capture it, secure the Volga River crossing, protect the flank of forces advancing into the Caucasus. But Hitler became fixated on Stalingrad's political symbolism. A city bearing Stalin's name must be captured to demonstrate German dominance and Soviet weakness. Operational logic gave way to political imperative. Resources that should have been concentrated in the Caucasus to secure oil fields were instead diverted to Stalingrad. Hoth watched this decision-making with professional horror. Strategy was being dictated by propaganda considerations rather than military necessity. September 1st brought 4th Panzer Army into the southern sections of Stalingrad itself. Urban warfare immediately revealed the problems Hoth had anticipated. Tanks designed for maneuver warfare became slow, vulnerable targets in city streets. A soldier with an anti-tank rifle in a building's upper floor could destroy a tank that couldn't elevate its gun to return fire. Every intersection was a potential ambush site. Rubble from destroyed buildings created obstacles that channeled movement into kill zones. Soviet defenders used the Volga's proximity brilliantly. They could be reinforced and supplied across the river, while German forces had extended supply lines vulnerable to interdiction. The Wehrmacht was fighting on terrain that negated every advantage of German doctrine. The grinding combat through September produced horrific casualty rates without significant progress. 6th Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, reported daily gains measured in meters, a factory captured after 4 days of fighting, a train station taken and lost and retaken. 4th Panzer Army supported from the southern sector, providing flank security and attempting to clear southern neighbourhoods. The fighting was intimate and brutal, room to room, hand to hand, with grenades and flamethrowers and point-blank shooting. German soldiers, trained for mobile operations, were instead fighting in conditions resembling Verdun or Stalingrad from the First World War. The psychological toll was immense. Hoth visited forward units and saw the strain in soldiers' faces, exhaustion, stress, the 1,000-metre stare of men pushed beyond normal limits. October 14th marked 6th Army's greatest effort, coordinated assault by 5 divisions, massive artillery support, airstrikes, attempting to capture the remaining Soviet-held sections in one final push. For 36 hours, it seemed possible. German forces penetrated to the Volga in several places, captured key factories, reduced Soviet-held territory to narrow strips along the riverbank, but they couldn't finish the job. Soviet reinforcements continued crossing the Volga at night. Soviet artillery from the river's east bank pounded German positions. The 62nd Soviet Army, defending Stalingrad under General Trikov, refused to collapse, despite losses that exceeded 50% of its strength. By October 16th, the German offensive had stalled short of complete victory, leaving 6th Army holding most of Stalingrad, but not all, and the parts they didn't hold were enough for Soviet defenders to maintain resistance. Hoth's role during this period was increasingly peripheral and frustrating. 4th Panzer Army wasn't fighting in the city, but rather providing flank security south and west of Stalingrad, defending against Soviet probing attacks, maintaining supply lines. This was necessary work, but not what panzer armies were designed for. Hoth's tanks and motorized infantry were being used as static defenses, expensive, mechanically complex forces sitting in defensive positions that regular infantry could hold. He repeatedly requested reassignment to mobile operations, arguing that 4th Panzer Army was being wasted. His requests were denied because there were no other forces available. The entire Wehrmacht was overstretched, with no strategic reserves, every unit committed to holding or attacking somewhere. November brought ominous intelligence reports that Hoth's staff analysed with growing alarm. Soviet forces were massing north of Stalingrad, across the Don River, facing Romanian Third Army. More Soviet forces massed south of the city, facing Romanian Fourth Army. The Romanian units were equipped with obsolete weapons, lacked anti-tank guns capable of fighting Soviet armour, had minimal artillery, and were overstretched across wide frontiers. Hoth's intelligence officers estimated Soviet strength at over 1 million troops in the 2 concentration areas, with over 1,000 tanks. This represented obvious preparation for major offensive. Hoth submitted warnings to 6th Army and Army Group headquarters, noting that the Romanian-held flanks were vulnerable, recommending either reinforcement or strategic withdrawal from Stalingrad before encirclement became possible. His warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon. Hitler had ordered Stalingrad captured, and German forces would maintain positions regardless of flank vulnerabilities. November 19th, 07:30 hours. Changed everything. Operation Uranus. Massive. Soviet counteroffensive struck both flanks simultaneously. Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad was hit by Southwest Front and Don Front, over 400,000 Soviet troops with 900 tanks. Romanian Fourth Army south of the city was struck by Stalingrad Front, over 300,000 troops with over 500 tanks. The Romanian defences, inadequate against such overwhelming force, collapsed within hours. Soviet tank columns poured through breakthroughs, exploiting with the same rapid, deep penetration that Germans had pioneered. By noon, it was clear this wasn't a local counterattack, but a strategic encirclement operation. Soviet forces were driving for link-up east of Stalingrad to trap 6th Army and parts of 4th Panzer Army in a massive pocket. Hoth reacted with immediate decisiveness born from professional training. At 1400 hours, without waiting for higher authorization, he ordered 4th Panzer Army to retreat southwest, away from the developing encirclement. This decision, technically insubordinate, saved his command. 4th Panzer Army units disengaged from positions, conducted fighting withdrawals, moved west and south to escape the closing Soviet pincers. Hoth personally supervised the retreat from a mobile command post, coordinating unit movements, ensuring no one was left behind. By November 21st, 4th Panzer Army had escaped encirclement, establishing positions southwest of Stalingrad. But 6th Army, locked in the city and slower to react, remained trapped. General Paulus requested permission to break out. Hitler refused, ordering 6th Army to hold Stalingrad and await relief. November 23rd brought the final closure. Soviet forces met at Kalach, completing the encirclement. 250,000 German and Axis troops were trapped in a pocket roughly 40 kilometers east-west and 30 kilometers north-south, centered on Stalingrad. The trapped forces included all of 6th Army, parts of 4th Panzer Army that hadn't escaped, Romanian units, artillery, support troops. They had food for perhaps 3 weeks, ammunition for continued combat, fuel for limited mobility. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the pocket by air. Hermann Göring personally guaranteed delivery of 500 tons of supplies daily. Hoth's logistics officers did the calculations and determined this was fantasy. The pocket required minimum 700 tons daily. The Luftwaffe didn't have enough transport aircraft. Soviet air defences would make flights suicidal. Göring's promise was a lie or delusion, but Hitler believed it and forbade breakout. Hoth's position after the encirclement was simultaneously elevated and impossible. 4th Panzer Army, now outside the pocket, was the strongest German mobile force in the sector. This made it the obvious choice to lead relief operations. But the force was inadequate for the mission. 4th Panzer Army had perhaps 230 tanks, 30,000 troops, limited artillery. Opposing them, Soviet forces were rapidly building defences around the Stalingrad pocket, multiple defensive lines, minefields, anti-tank positions. Intelligence estimated Soviet strength at 400,000 troops, with over 1,000 tanks between 4th Panzer Army's positions and the trapped 6th Army. Hoth would be attacking into prepared defences with 5-to-1 numerical disadvantage against an enemy fighting on interior lines with short supply routes. The mission was operationally nearly impossible. But orders were orders. 4th Panzer Army would prepare to relieve Stalingrad. Hoth began planning with characteristic thoroughness, knowing the mission would probably fail but determined to maximise the small chance of success. He requested reinforcements, received 1 additional Panzer division, some artillery, air support promises. He studied maps identifying the shortest route to the pocket, approximately 100 kilometres through Soviet-held territory. He calculated supply requirements, attack timelines, coordination procedures. He also prepared something not officially sanctioned, contingency plans for 6th Army to break out toward his relief force, rather than waiting passively. The breakout operation was codenamed Thunderclap, and it would require Hitler's authorization. Hoth knew authorization was unlikely, But he prepared anyway because soldiers' lives depended on having plans ready if circumstances changed. December approached with winter closing in again. Hoth's soldiers, veterans of the previous winter, felt dread at approaching cold. They had winter clothing this year, better equipment, more preparation, but they also had memories of frozen comrades and frostbitten limbs. And now they were being asked to attack in winter, to advance 100 kilometers through enemy territory, to rescue a trapped army that probably couldn't be rescued. It was a mission that required everything 4th Panzer Army had, and more courage, skill, determination, and luck. Hoth addressed his commanders with brutal honesty. The mission was nearly impossible. Casualties would be severe. Success required perfect execution and favourable circumstances. But 250,000 soldiers' lives depended on the attempt, and German military honour demanded maximum effort regardless of probable failure. The road to Stalingrad had become a cauldron-consuming strength. Now, 4th Panzer Army would march into that cauldron, attempting the impossible. It was Hoth's ultimate test as a commander. And it would define his legacy not as conqueror of France, but as the man who tried and failed to save Stalingrad. The winter storm was gathering, and Hermann Hoth was leading his soldiers into its heart. December 12, 1942, 0530, southwest of Stalingrad. In darkness and bitter cold, Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army begins Operation Winter Storm, the relief of Stalingrad. 230 tanks of LVII Panzer Corps advanced northward through snow-covered steppe, spearheaded by 6th Panzer Division with its precious Tigers. 48 kilometres distant, trapped soldiers of 6th Army hear their artillery and know relief is coming. But between Hoth's spearhead and salvation stands the Soviet 51st Army, 150,000 troops with over 400 tanks, dug into defensive positions prepared over 3 weeks. The operational mathematics are simple and terrible. Hoth must advance 100 kilometres through prepared defences against 5-to-1 numerical odds, while maintaining logistics across exposed supply lines in winter weather, and he must do it fast enough that trapped 6th Army doesn't starve or run out of ammunition. It's nearly impossible. But Hoth has spent 35 years mastering operational art. If anyone can achieve the impossible, it's him. The question is whether mastery is enough when strategic circumstances are this unfavourable. The first day exceeded expectations. LVII Panzer Corps advanced 15 kilometres, smashing through initial Soviet defences. The Tigers proved devastating, destroying Soviet 34 tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. German tactical coordination functioned well. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support, working as integrated system despite winter conditions. By nightfall, December 12th, Hoth's spearheads had covered nearly 1/5 of the distance to Stalingrad. Encircled soldiers in the pocket listened to radio broadcasts describing the relief force's progress. Hope, dangerous and painful, began spreading through 6th Army's frozen positions. Maybe rescue was possible. Maybe they would survive. December 13th brought harder fighting as Soviet defenders recovered from initial surprise. The 51st Army commander, General Trufanov, committed reserves to critical sectors, thickening defences along Hoth's axis of advance. German progress slowed to 8 kilometres, respectable but below the tempo necessary for success. The casualties were mounting. 6th Panzer Division reported losing 20 tanks, 200 men. 23rd Panzer Division lost 15 tanks, over 300 casualties. These were acceptable losses in traditional calculations, but unsustainable for a force that had no reserves. Every destroyed tank, every killed soldier made the force weaker and success less likely. Hoth watched the attrition with professional detachment masking deep anxiety. He was burning his army to achieve an objective that might be unreachable. December 14th marked the breakthrough at Aksai River, a small waterway that had been turned into a formidable obstacle by Soviet engineers. Minefields, anti-tank ditches, dug-in positions on the far bank. Hoth committed his entire striking force, both panzer divisions, attacking simultaneously with massive artillery support. The battle raged all day. Tigers led the assault, their heavy armour absorbing anti-tank fire that would destroy lesser vehicles. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Infantry crossed in assault boats. By nightfall, LVII Panzer Corps held bridgeheads across the Axis. The cost was 28 tanks lost, over 450 casualties, but the breakthrough was achieved, and open terrain lay beyond. Hoth ordered immediate exploitation, no pause, advance through the night, maintain momentum. December 15th brought the furthest advance 40 kilometers in one day, the fastest progress of the operation. Soviet defenses weren't continuous, and German forces infiltrated through gaps, exploiting with classic armoured warfare techniques. By evening, lead elements of 6th Panzer Division reached the Maishkova River, 48 kilometers from Stalingrad pocket. Through binoculars, German officers could see artillery flashes from 6th Army positions. They were close, so close. Radio contact was established with 6th Army headquarters. Hoth requested authorization for Thunderclap 6th Army breaking out to link up with his relief force. The request went through chain of command, Hoth to Army Group headquarters to Hitler's headquarters. And then came the decision that sealed Stalingrad's fate. December 16th brought Hitler's refusal. 6th Army would not break out. They would hold positions and wait for relief to reach them. The reasoning was partly military. Hitler believed breakout would abandon equipment and heavy weapons, weakening 6th Army even if soldiers escaped. It was partly political. Abandoning Stalingrad would be propaganda defeat. And it was partly psychological. Hitler had invested enormous prestige in Stalingrad's capture and couldn't accept its loss. General Paulus, commanding 6th Army, protested weakly but wouldn't act without authorization. Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, also requested Hitler-authorized breakout, refused. The 250,000 trapped soldiers would wait passively while Hoth's 48-kilometer advance tried to become 100 kilometers against growing resistance. The crisis came December 17th through 20th as Soviet reinforcements flooded the sector. Soviet 51st Army received 2 additional corps, 80,000 troops, 200 tanks. Soviet 2nd Guards Army deployed south of Hoth's position, threatening his flank and supply lines. The numerical imbalance, already daunting, became overwhelming. Hoth now faced roughly 350,000 Soviet troops, with over 600 tanks, using only 30,000 men and perhaps 180 operational tanks. His losses had reduced strength 10%. The Germans were outnumbered 10-1 in infantry, 3-1 in armour, and Soviet forces occupied interior lines, while German supplies stretched back 80 kilometers across exposed steppe. December 18th marked the Battle of Verkhneykumsky's 6th Panzer Division, defending against counterattacks from 3 directions simultaneously. Soviet forces attempted to cut off Hoth's spearhead, encircling the relief force itself. The fighting was desperate, chaotic, conducted in -25 Celsius temperatures with blowing snow, reducing visibility. German tanks fought from defensive positions, ammunition running critically low. Hoth committed his last reserves. Elements of 23rd Panzer Division moved north to support 6th Panzer. The defence held, but barely. Casualty reports made grim reading. 120 tanks destroyed or damaged. Over 3,000 men killed or wounded in 3 days. 4th Panzer Army was burning itself out, achieving nothing but maintaining position 48 kilometers from Stalingrad. December 21st brought impossible choice. Soviet forces were clearly preparing massive attack against 4th Panzer Army's flanks. Intelligence detected troop concentrations, artillery positioning, tank formations. Hoth could maintain position and be encircled like 6th Army, or he could retreat and abandon the relief effort. Staying meant potential destruction of 4th Panzer Army, eliminating any future possibility of relief. Retreating meant abandoning 6th Army to its fate, but preserving 4th Panzer Army as functioning military force. Hoth made the professional decision, the correct military decision, the decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He ordered retreat. 4th Panzer Army would withdraw southwest to defensive positions on the Kotelnikovo axis. December 24th, Christmas Eve. 4th Panzer Army retreated under heavy pressure, conducting fighting withdrawals while Soviet forces attacked pursuing columns. The retreat was orderly but costly. Rearguard actions, abandoned vehicles that broke down, medical units evacuating wounded under fire. By nightfall, December 24th, 4th Panzer Army had withdrawn to positions 70 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. The relief operation had failed. Winterstorm had advanced 48 kilometers at cost of 120 tanks and 16,000 casualties, 50% losses in 13 days. The operation had achieved nothing except demonstrate that rescue was impossible. In Stalingrad pocket, soldiers received the news that relief wasn't coming. Hope, which had burned briefly, died. They were alone. Rescue wouldn't come. They would fight until ammunition ran out, then surrender or die. The aftermath of Winterstorm revealed both Hoth's excellence and his limitations. Operationally, he'd commanded brilliantly achieved breakthrough against superior forces, advanced 48 kilometers in horrific conditions, maintained unit cohesion throughout. The failure wasn't his, it was strategic impossibility meeting tactical reality. No commander could have done better with available forces, but brilliance was insufficient. The mission required miracles, and miracles don't happen in warfare. Hoth had learned this lesson repeatedly in Moscow's winter, in Stalingrad's summer, now in Stalingrad's winter. Tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic failure. Individual competence cannot substitute for adequate resources. And honor-bound soldiers cannot save comrades when those comrades are sacrificed to political delusion. The human toll haunted Hoth. He'd led 16,000 men into battle knowing many wouldn't return. He'd ordered attacks against prepared positions knowing casualties would be severe. He'd made the decision to retreat knowing it abandoned 250,000 soldiers to death or captivity. These decisions were militarily correct. Bad decisions would have produced worse outcomes. But correctness didn't eliminate moral weight. Hoth was a professional soldier, trained to make difficult decisions, but he was also a human being who understood that every casualty represented destroyed futures, grieving families, wasted lives. The professionalism that allowed him to function through such knowledge was both necessary and terrible. January 1943 brought the end. 6th Army in Stalingrad pocket held out until February 2nd, fighting. With diminishing ammunition and food, suffering starvation and frostbite, finally surrendering when further resistance became physically impossible. Of the 250,000 encircled, approximately 91,000 surrendered. The rest died, killed in combat, starved, frozen, or dying of disease in the pocket's final weeks. Of the 91,000 prisoners, only about 6,000 survived Soviet captivity to return to Germany years later. Stalingrad became synonym for catastrophic defeat, military disaster on unprecedented scale. And Hermann Hoth, who tried to prevent the catastrophe, who'd commanded the only serious rescue attempt, who'd done everything professionally possible, lived with knowledge that excellence had been insufficient. Winterstorm was his finest operational performance. It was also his greatest failure. The impossible had proven impossible, and thousands of soldiers paid the price for attempting what strategy should never have required. July 5th, 1943, 0500 hours. Kursk, salient, Soviet Union. Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, rebuilt after Stalingrad, reinforced with new equipment, strengthened with additional divisions, prepares for Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. Before him stretches the Kursk salient, a massive Soviet-held bulge in German lines, 160 kilometers wide and 120 kilometers deep. Intelligence reports that Soviet forces have fortified this salient with 8 defensive belts, thousands of anti-tank guns, extensive minefields, dug-in tanks. Hoth commands 1,200 tanks, including over 100 new Panthers and 45 Tigers, the most powerful German armoured force ever assembled. On paper, this force should smash through any defence. But Hoth knows the mathematics have changed. The Soviets aren't the disorganised enemy of 1941. They've learned German tactics, developed counter doctrines, and most importantly, they have resources Germany cannot match. This offensive will be Germany's last thunder maximum effort with finite resources against an enemy whose strength grows daily. Win or lose, it's the final time German armour will attack rather than defend. The question isn't whether Germany can achieve tactical victory. Hoth is confident his forces can penetrate Soviet defences. The question is whether tactical victory produces strategic results. And Hoth, having watched strategic failure devour tactical success repeatedly, harbours deep doubts. The planning for Citadel revealed strategic confusion that had infected German high command. The operation was conceived in March when the Kursk salient first appeared. Eliminating it would shorten German defensive lines and potentially encircle large Soviet forces. But Hitler delayed execution repeatedly, waiting for new Panthers to arrive, wanting overwhelming force to guarantee success. Each delay gave Soviets more time to fortify. By July, what should have been surprise offensive had become predictable attack against prepared defences. Hoth argued for either immediate execution in April or cancelling the operation entirely. Instead, Hitler chose the worst option, attacking in July when Soviet preparation was complete, but German forces hadn't grown sufficiently to offset Soviet advantages. The force comparison was superficially favourable. Operation Citadel committed 780,000 German troops, 2,700 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces, 1,800 aircraft, massive concentration, representing significant portion of Wehrmacht combat power on Eastern Front. But Soviet forces in and around Kursk totaled 1.9 million troops, 5,000 tanks, over 20,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. The Germans were outnumbered 2-1 in troops, nearly 2-1 in tanks, 2-1 in artillery, substantially in aircraft. These weren't 1941 ratios where tactical superiority could offset numerical disadvantage. By 1943, Soviet tactical competence had improved dramatically. They'd learned combined arms warfare, developed effective anti-tank tactics, mastered defensive operations. The qualitative gap between Wehrmacht and Red Army had narrowed considerably. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army attacked from the southern face of the salient, forming southern pincer of the operation, while 9th Army attacked from north. The plan called for both forces to penetrate 70 kilometres, meeting at Kursk city to complete encirclement. Hoth's force included 3 Panzer Corps, XLV, Panzer Corps with Grossdeutschland Division and 2 Panzer divisions, 2 SS Panzer Corps with 3 elite SS Panzer Grenadier divisions, plus supporting infantry. This represented extraordinary striking power, over 650 tanks in Hoth's sector alone, including most of Germany's new heavy armour. The new Panther tank, with its long 75mm gun and sloped armour, was superior to 34 in firepower and protection. The Tiger remained the most powerful tank on any battlefield. If equipment quality could win battles, 4th Panzer Army should achieve breakthrough. July 5th, the attack began with artillery preparation at 0500, followed by ground assault at 0530. Initial progress was encouraging. Hoth's forces penetrated 6 to 8 kilometers on the first day, breaking through Soviet first defensive belts. German coordination was excellent. Tanks, infantry, engineers, artillery, and air support functioning as integrated system. The new Panthers performed well when they worked, destroying Soviet tanks at long range. Tigers were nearly invincible to Soviet anti-tank fire, serving as breakthrough specialists. But the advance was measured in single-digit kilometres rather than the 30 to 60 kilometres per day that France 1940 had seen. Soviet defences were simply too deep, too well prepared, too competently defended. July 7th marked typical day of Kursk offensive hard fighting for minimal gains. 4th Panzer Army advanced 3 to 4 kilometres at cost of 25 tanks destroyed, over 400 casualties. Soviet defenders employed defence in depth perfectly. First line resisted to slow attackers, second line counterattacked to disrupt momentum, third line absorbed exhausted attacks. Soviet anti-tank guns were positioned in mutually supporting positions, creating kill zones where German tanks were engaged from multiple angles. Soviet artillery, dramatically improved since 1941, delivered massive fire concentrations on German assault formations, and Soviet commanders showed operational flexibility, committing reserves at critical moments to prevent German breakthrough. Hoth was achieving tactical success, his forces were advancing, inflicting heavy Soviet casualties, demonstrating professional competence. But strategic breakthrough wasn't materializing. The front was moving but not breaking. July 12th brought the Battle of Prokhorovka, largest tank battle in history, though not the decisive Soviet victory propaganda later claimed. IISS Panzer Corps, having penetrated approximately 30 kilometers, encountered Soviet 5th Guards tank army in meeting engagement near Prokhorovka village. Approximately 800 German tanks fought 900 Soviet tanks in chaotic close-range combat across open terrain. The battle was tactically indecisive. Both sides lost roughly 300 to 400 tanks. Both maintained fighting capability afterward. But strategically, the battle revealed Operation Citadel's failure. After 7 days of maximum effort, 4th Panzer Army had advanced only 30 kilometers, less than half the distance required to reach Kursk city. Casualty and tank losses, while roughly equal to Soviet losses, were unsustainable for Germany. The Wehrmacht couldn't replace losses at rates matching Soviet production and manpower reserves. July 13th brought Hitler's cancellation of Citadel, not because of battlefield failure, but because Allied invasion of Sicily required redeployment of German forces to Mediterranean. Hoth received orders to halt offensive, prepare to transfer divisions to Italy. The timing was catastrophic from operational perspective. 4th Panzer Army had achieved breakthrough into Soviet tactical depth. Another week of fighting might reach operational depth. But strategic situation wouldn't allow continuation. Germany was fighting multi-front war with insufficient resources, and crisis in one theatre forced abandonment of operations in another. Hoth prepared withdrawal orders with bitter professionalism. 8 days of offensive had cost 4th Panzer Army approximately 20,000 casualties and 300 tanks, 10% personnel losses, 25% tank losses, achieving only 30 kilometers penetration that would now be abandoned. The Soviet counteroffensive began immediately, July 15th. Massive attacks struck German positions across Kursk salient and beyond. The Red Army wasn't content with defensive victory. They attacked German forces while still disorganized from offensive operations, achieving operational surprise and significant penetrations. 4th Panzer Army found itself defending desperately against enemy counteroffensive, conducting fighting withdrawals to avoid encirclement. The initiative had completely shifted. Wehrmacht was no longer dictating the war's course, but reacting to enemy action. By August, German forces had been pushed back beyond their July starting positions, surrendering all territory gained and more. The Eastern Front, which had been relatively stable since spring, was now moving west as Soviet forces advanced across broad front. The cost of Kursk extended beyond immediate casualties. Operation Citadel consumed Germany's strategic reserves, the rebuilt Panzer divisions, the new equipment, the carefully accumulated strength. These resources were expended achieving nothing of strategic value. After Kursk, Wehrmacht never regained offensive capability on Eastern Front. Every subsequent operation would be defensive, holding ground, counter-attacking locally, conducting fighting withdrawals. The strategic initiative had irreversibly shifted to Soviet Union. Germany would fight skilled defensive battles for 22 more months, would demonstrate that Wehrmacht retained tactical excellence even in defeat, but would never again pose offensive threat to Soviet forces. For Hoth personally, Kursk represented recognition that Germany had lost the war. Not militarily lost, the Wehrmacht would fight effectively for 2 more years. But strategically lost, the mathematical realities were inescapable. Soviet industrial production exceeded German capacity. Soviet manpower reserves dwarfed German population. American entry into war meant Allied superiority would grow exponentially. Germany was fighting enemies whose combined resources it couldn't match, while German resources were depleting through attrition. Tactical skill, operational excellence, professional competence, these attributes the Wehrmacht still possessed. But they couldn't overcome resource disadvantage when that disadvantage was 3-1 or 5-1 or 10-1, depending on sector and moment. August through October saw 4th Panzer Army conducting continuous defensive operations as Soviet forces pressed westward. Hoth demonstrated that German army remained formidable even in retreat, conducting mobile defences, executing counterattacks to disrupt Soviet offensives, inflicting heavy casualties on attackers. His command of defensive warfare was as skilled as his offensive operations had been. But defence meant trading space for time, yielding territory, falling back toward Germany. Each successful defensive battle was still a retreat. Each Soviet casualty was replaced by Soviet production, while German losses depleted irreplaceable strength. Hoth understood the mathematics Germany was losing by not losing fast enough. Every day the war continued, German relative strength declined. November 1943 brought Hoth's relief from Command Hitler's response to 4th Panzer Army's retreat from Kiev. The city, captured with such cost in 1941, was liberated by Soviet forces in massive offensive that 4th Panzer Army couldn't contain. Hoth was blamed for the loss, though any commander would have faced same strategic impossibility. His relief reflected Hitler's increasing tendency to blame field commanders for defeats that strategic situation made inevitable. Hoth was placed in Führer Reserve, essentially forced retirement, sidelined for remainder of war. He would never command in combat again. The Master of Armoured Warfare, one of Wehrmacht's most competent operational commanders, was dismissed because acknowledging strategic failure was psychologically impossible for Hitler's regime. The last thunder at Kursk had indeed been final. Operation Citadel represented Wehrmacht's ultimate offensive gasp, maximum effort, with best available equipment achieving minimal results. The correlation of forces had shifted irreversibly. German tactical excellence remained real but insufficient. Hoth had commanded as well as humanly possible coordinated complex operations, demonstrated professional competence, minimized casualties given circumstances. But excellence couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. The inheritance of Prussian military tradition, transformed through secret academies and mechanized revolution, proven in France's triumph, tested in Russia's vastness, had reached its limit. Armour could still maneuver, soldiers still fought bravely, commanders still demonstrated skill, but the war was lost. And Hermann Hoth, watching from forced retirement, would witness Germany's collapse, knowing that his tactical mastery had been employed in ultimately futile cause. The thunder had faded. Only the storm's aftermath remained destruction, defeat, and reckoning for crimes committed in service of criminal regime. The descent toward ultimate catastrophe was accelerating, and there would be no redemption in the ruins. November 15th, 1943. Ukraine. Hermann Hoth receives the telegram that ends his career relieved of command of 4th Panzer Army, effective immediately, report to OKH headquarters for reassignment. The official reason is operational failure, the retreat from Kiev that lost a city Hitler had declared must be held. The real reason is that Hitler requires scapegoats for defeats, that strategic situation makes inevitable, and field commanders are convenient targets. Hoth has commanded continuously since September 1939, participated in every major German campaign, demonstrated operational excellence in victory and defeat. None of it matters. At 58 years old, with 38 years of military service, he's being cast aside because acknowledging systemic failure is impossible for the Nazi regime. He leaves 4th Panzer Army headquarters without ceremony, transfers command to his successor, and departs for Germany. Behind him, the army he built and commanded continues fighting, continues retreating, continues the losing struggle against overwhelming Soviet strength. Ahead lies forced retirement, survival through Germany's collapse, and eventually something Hoth never anticipated, criminal prosecution for crimes committed by forces under his command. The period from November 1943 through May 1945 saw Hoth in Führer Reserve military limbo, where dismissed commanders awaited possible reassignment that rarely came. He spent these months in relative obscurity, living in Bavaria, watching Germany's military situation deteriorate from distance. The Eastern Front moved steadily westward as Soviet forces advanced. The Western Front opened with Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944. Germany was now fighting multi-front war it couldn't sustain, experiencing exactly the strategic encirclement that Prussian-German military tradition had always feared. Hoth followed the campaigns in newspapers and through professional networks, recognizing the operational patterns, understanding that Wehrmacht was conducting skilled defensive warfare, but that skill only delayed inevitable defeat. The professional distance from events didn't insulate Hoth from Germany's collapse. Allied bombing reduced German cities to rubble. He experienced air raids personally, understood that civilian population was paying terrible price for regime's aggression. Food shortages, fuel rationing, infrastructure collapse. The home front was disintegrating as Wehrmacht's perimeter contracted. Soviet forces entered East Prussia in January 1945, bringing war to German territory with vengeful fury. Reports of Soviet atrocities against German civilians created panic. Hoth, like many Germans, began understanding that Germany would not just lose the war, but experience catastrophic defeat with terrible consequences. The question was survival, how to navigate the final months, where to surrender, how to avoid Soviet captivity. May 1945 brought Germany's unconditional surrender and Hoth's capture by American forces in Bavaria. The 7th US Army took custody of numerous German generals who'd remained in southern Germany, including Hoth. Initially, the captivity was relatively comfortable. Senior officers were housed in proper facilities, treated according to Geneva Conventions, interrogated by American intelligence but not abused. Hoth cooperated with interrogations, providing detailed accounts of Eastern Front operations. American officers were professionally interested in German operational art, recognizing that Wehrmacht had developed mechanized warfare doctrine more effectively than Western allies. Hoth's expertise was valuable. American and British militaries were already contemplating potential conflict with Soviet Union, and German experience fighting Red Army was directly relevant. But the comfortable early captivity wouldn't last. Between 1945 and 1947, Allied authorities conducted increasingly thorough investigations of Wehrmacht conduct during the war. The Nuremberg trials of major war criminals in 1945 through 1946 established that organizations including Wehrmacht High Command had participated in criminal activities, massacres of civilians, execution of prisoners, support for SS operations, implementation of criminal orders. The legal principle being established was command responsibility. Commanders were accountable for crimes committed by subordinate units, even if commanders didn't personally perpetrate crimes. This principle would eventually reach field commanders like Hoth, who'd focused on operations while subordinate units committed atrocities. October 1947 brought Hoth's indictment in the High Command trial, one of 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials prosecuting German military and civilian leadership. Hoth was charged alongside 13 other senior Wehrmacht officers with crimes including participation in planning aggressive war crimes against prisoners and civilians, and crimes against humanity. The specific allegations against Hoth focused on his command of Panzer Group 3 and later 3rd Panzer Army during 1941 through 1942. Prosecutors presented evidence that units under Hoth's command had participated in massacres of Soviet prisoners, execution of political commissars per Hitler's Commissar order, support for SS Einsatzgruppen operations, and destruction of civilian property beyond military necessity. The trial, lasting from February through October 1948, forced Hoth to confront moral dimensions of his professional service that he'd avoided during the war. Prosecutors presented documents bearing his signature implementing criminal orders. They showed that Hoth's headquarters had coordinated with SS units conducting mass executions. They demonstrated that Hoth had been informed of atrocities and failed to intervene or report up chain of command. The evidence was damning not because it showed Hoth personally killing civilians he hadn't, but because it demonstrated institutional complicity. Wehrmacht units provided security for mass shootings. Wehrmacht logistics supported SS operations. Wehrmacht intelligence shared information about Jewish populations and partisan activities that led to massacres, and Wehrmacht commanders like Hoth, focused on operational concerns, had allowed these crimes to occur under their nominal command authority. Hoth's defense strategy was typical of Wehrmacht officers at Nuremberg. He claimed ignorance of SS activities, argued that operational pressures prevented attention to rear area matters, maintained that he opposed criminal behaviour when aware of it. Some of this was true. Hoth genuinely focused on operational warfare rather than occupation policies. He probably didn't know details of every massacre committed in his command areas. But the legal standard was command responsibility. Commanders were responsible for establishing command climate and ensuring subordinates followed laws of war. Hoth had failed these responsibilities. His defence that operational pressures excused inattention to criminal conduct was rejected. Professional soldiers were expected to maintain moral and legal standards even under stress of combat operations. The prosecution's case included specific examples that devastated Hoth's defence. In July 1941, Panzer Group 3 units had participated in rounding up Soviet prisoners who were then executed by SS units, approximately 5,000 men killed over 3 days. Hoth's headquarters had provided transportation and security for these operations. In August 1941, 3rd Panzer Army had implemented Hitler's Commissar order, which mandated execution of Soviet political officers captured in combat. Hoth had signed implementing orders distributing the Commissar order to subordinate units. In September 1941, Hoth's units had cordoned off areas where SS Einsatzgruppen conducted mass shootings of Jewish civilians. These weren't incidental crimes, they were systematic policies that Hoth's command had facilitated. October 28th, 1948 brought the verdict guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The tribunal found that Hoth had signed and transmitted criminal orders, that units under his command had committed atrocities, and that he'd failed to prevent or punish such crimes. His sentence? 15 years imprisonment. 3 other defendants received death sentences, others received sentences ranging from time served to 20 years. Hoth's sentence reflected the tribunal's finding that while he was criminally responsible, his personal culpability was less than commanders who'd actively encouraged atrocities. He was a professional soldier who'd focused on operational matters while allowing crimes to occur, rather than ideological criminal who'd promoted Nazi racial policies. Both were criminal, but the tribunal distinguished degrees of guilt. Hoth served 6 years of his sentence in Landsberg prison, the same facility where Hitler had been imprisoned after his failed 1923 putsch. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Hoth's health deteriorated during imprisonment. He was 63 at conviction, entering his 70s during incarceration. In 1954, responding to pressure from West German government and Cold War considerations that made German military expertise valuable against Soviet threat, American authorities released Hoth and several other convicted Wehrmacht officers. He'd served less than half his sentence. The early release generated controversy. Victims' advocates argued that war criminals were being freed prematurely for political reasons. Cold War realists argued that West Germany needed rehabilitation and that holding aging officers served no purpose. The post-release years, 1954 through 1971, saw Hoth living quietly in Bavaria. He wrote memoirs focused on operational matters, carefully avoiding discussion of atrocities or his conviction. His writings emphasized tactical and operational lessons from Eastern Front campaigns, positioning himself as professional soldier rather than criminal. He occasionally corresponded with former Wehrmacht officers, participated in veterans gatherings, provided interviews to military historians. But he never publicly acknowledged moral responsibility for crimes committed under his command. His position remained consistent. He'd been a professional soldier doing his duty. Operational pressures had been extreme. He'd opposed criminal behaviour when aware of it, and his conviction was unjust. This stance was common among Wehrmacht officers, maintaining myth of clean Wehrmacht that fought honourably despite Nazi regime's criminality. December 25th, 1971, Christmas Day, Hermann Hoth died at age 85 in Goslar, West Germany. His death received minimal notice. He wasn't famous like Rommel or Guderian. He hadn't written best-selling memoirs or become Cold War consultant. He'd lived final years as an obscure old man whose past was complicated and controversial. His obituaries noted his role as Panzer commander, but couldn't ignore his conviction for war crimes. The legacy was irreparably divided: operational excellence and criminal, complicity, professional competence and moral failure, tactical brilliance and institutional evil. How to remember such a figure? Military professionals studied his campaigns, recognising his contributions to armoured warfare doctrine. Moral philosophers used his case to examine command responsibility and professional ethics. Historians struggled to balance his military achievements against his criminal conduct. The reckoning for Hermann Hoth revealed the tragedy of professional excellence in service of evil regime. He was a genuinely skilled commander. His operational abilities were real. His contributions to armoured warfare significant. His competence undeniable. In different circumstances, commanding democratic nation in defensive war, he might be remembered as unambiguous military hero. But he served Hitler's regime, commanded forces conducting war of annihilation and racial extermination, facilitated crimes against humanity through institutional complicity. The professional skills that made him effective commander also made him effective instrument of genocidal war. His dismissal from command was Hitler's convenience. His imprisonment and conviction were justice's requirements, and his legacy remains cautionary tale that military excellence without moral foundation is not just insufficient but potentially dangerous, that professional competence must be grounded in ethical responsibility, and that following orders is never adequate defence when those orders serve criminal purposes. The master of armoured warfare ended his days as convicted war criminal. Both descriptions are accurate. Both must be acknowledged, and the tension between them cannot be resolved, only recognised as essential truth about Hermann Hoth's complicated, compromised, and ultimately tragic career, present day. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In a secure classroom at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, American officers study Operation Winter Storm Hermann Hoth's failed relief of Stalingrad. The instructors analyze Hoth's operational planning, his coordination of combined arms, his decision-making under pressure. They note his professional competence, his realistic assessment of probabilities, his courage in attempting nearly impossible mission. The case study is titled Limited Resources, Maximum Effort, the Stalingrad Relief Attempt. Nowhere in the presentation does it mention that the commander being studied was convicted war criminal. The focus is purely operational, what military professionals can learn from Hoth's campaign about logistics, coordination, decision-making under uncertainty. Similar lessons are taught at military academies in Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere. Hermann Hoth remains studied decades after his death by professionals who recognize his expertise while carefully avoiding moral questions about the regime he served. This divided legacy operational excellence remembered, criminal complicity minimized defines how Western militaries grapple with Wehrmacht's complicated history. The scholarly assessment of Hoth evolved significantly from 1945 through present. Immediate post-war histories, written when memories were fresh and moral judgments were clear, portrayed Wehrmacht generally and Hoth specifically as instruments of Nazi aggression. These accounts emphasized criminal conduct, rejected clean Wehrmacht mythology, made clear that professional competence didn't excuse institutional evil. But Cold War brought reassessment. West needed German military expertise against Soviet threat, which created incentive to rehabilitate Wehrmacht reputation. Histories written in 1950s and 60s emphasized Wehrmacht's operational excellence while downplaying war crimes. Hoth benefited from this rehabilitation. His conviction was mentioned briefly, if at all, while his operational achievements received detailed analysis. The 1980s and 90s brought historical correction as archives opened and generational distance allowed more honest assessment. Scholars like Omer Bartov, Hannes Heer, and Jeffrey Megagy demonstrated comprehensively that Wehrmacht was deeply complicit in Nazi crimes, not just SS, not just a few bad commanders, but institutional participation in criminal war. Research into Hoth's record revealed extent of his command responsibility. He'd signed criminal orders, his units had committed atrocities, his professed ignorance was willful blindness. Modern scholarship recognizes both his operational competence and his criminal conduct, refusing to separate the two. This creates complex portrait-skilled commander who was also war criminal, professional soldier who served genocidal regime, tactical genius whose excellence enabled mass murder. The comparison with Heinz Guderian illuminates how personality affects legacy. Guderian, the flamboyant self-promoter who wrote best-selling memoir Panzer Leader in 1950, shaped his own historical reputation. He portrayed himself as a apolitical professional opposed to Nazi excesses, claimed ignorance of war crimes, emphasized operational innovations while minimizing moral questions. His memoir became foundational text for armor warfare, translated into multiple languages, read by military professionals worldwide. Guderian died in 1954 before full extent of Wehrmacht criminality was documented, allowing his self-mythology to persist. Hoth, by contrast, wrote no widely read memoirs, avoided publicity, lived to see his war crimes conviction. He couldn't shape his legacy as Guderian did. Result: Guderian is famous, Hoth obscure. But modern scholarship shows both were complicit in criminal war, both were professionally competent, both exemplified Wehrmacht's moral corruption. The statistical legacy of Hoth's career reveals the human cost of his operational excellence. During 4 years of command, September 1939 through November 19, 43 forces under Hoth's command participated in encircling approximately 2 million enemy soldiers across multiple campaigns. They advanced thousands of kilometers across European and Soviet territory. They fought in every major German operation, from Poland through Kursk. The forces Hoth commanded suffered approximately 150,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing over 4 years of combat operations. These are conservative estimates. Precise numbers are impossible because records are incomplete and units were constantly reorganized. But the scale is clear. Hoth commanded significant forces in major operations with substantial casualties on both sides. The technological legacy of Hoth's service was his contribution to armoured warfare doctrine that persists today. Modern mechanized warfare still applies principles that Hoth helped develop: concentration of force at decisive points, combined arms coordination, exploitation into operational depth, logistics planning for sustained operations. When American armor forces executed deep penetrations during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, they employed doctrinal concepts descended from Wehrmacht practice. When Israeli defense forces conduct mobile operations, they reference German innovations in mechanized warfare. The tactical and operational level lessons from Hoth's campaigns remain valid. Military reality doesn't change because the practitioner served evil cause. This creates uncomfortable reality we learn from war criminals because their professional expertise was real even though their moral failure was absolute. The ethical question of studying Hoth remains controversial. Some argue that using his campaigns as case studies implicitly celebrates or rehabilitates a war criminal, that professional excellence in service of genocide shouldn't be studied without constant moral condemnation. Others argue that operational lessons can be separated from moral context, that studying tactics doesn't require approving the strategist's character. The military education community generally adopts middle position: study the operations, acknowledge the criminality, extract lessons while maintaining moral clarity. Instructors teaching Hoth's campaigns now typically include sections on command, responsibility, and professional ethics, using his career as cautionary tale about what happens when professional competence lacks moral foundation. The comparative analysis of armoured warfare commanders reveals Hoth's distinctive characteristics. He was more systematic than Guderian, less flamboyant than Rommel, more cautious than Manstein, more aggressive than Model. His strength was consistent professional competence rather than brilliant innovation or personal heroics. He didn't invent armoured warfare doctrine like Guderian, didn't inspire subordinates through personal example like Rommel, didn't demonstrate operational genius like Manstein. What he did was execute complex operations professionally, manage logistics carefully, maintain unit cohesion under stress, make realistic assessments of situations. In an army that emphasized aggressive leadership and tactical audacity, Hoth represented methodical professionalism. This made him valuable but not celebrated. His campaigns don't produce dramatic narratives of breakthrough and exploitation. They show careful planning, coordinated execution, realistic adaptation to circumstances. The German military's relationship with Hoth's legacy is particularly complex. Modern Bundeswehr, established in 1955, struggled to define relationship with Wehrmacht past. Early years saw many former Wehrmacht officers in Bundeswehr creating institutional continuity that included honouring Wehrmacht traditions while officially rejecting Nazi ideology. This produced uncomfortable compromises: barracks named for Wehrmacht, commanders later renamed, military ceremonies honouring bravery of Wehrmacht soldiers, later modified emphasis on operational traditions while minimising criminal conduct. Hoth wasn't prominent enough to have barracks named for him, but his campaigns were studied in Bundeswehr staff colleges. 21st century Bundeswehr takes clearer position. Wehrmacht's operational lessons can be studied while absolutely condemning the regime it served and the crimes it committed. Hoth's career is presented as negative example: professional competence without ethical grounding produces moral catastrophe. The question of whether Hoth was Nazi ideologue or professional soldier serving existing government is debatable but ultimately irrelevant to moral judgment. Evidence suggests he wasn't fanatical Nazi, he didn't join the party until late, his writings lack ideological fervour, his motivations seem primarily professional rather than political. But this doesn't excuse his conduct. Professional soldiers serving totalitarian regimes cannot escape moral responsibility by claiming apolitical professionalism. The Wehrmacht implemented criminal policies as institutional practice, not through aberrant individuals' misconduct. Hoth's focus on operational matters, while ignoring or facilitating crimes committed by forces under his command, made him complicit regardless of personal ideology. The good German defence that he opposed Nazi excesses but followed orders as professional soldier was rejected at Nuremberg and remains rejected by serious historians. The legacy impact extends beyond military history to broader questions about professional ethics in extreme circumstances. Medical ethicists study Wehrmacht doctors who participated in Nazi medical experiments, asking how medical professionals became complicit in crimes against humanity. Legal scholars study Wehrmacht judge advocates who applied military justice in racially discriminatory ways. Business historians study industrialists who used slave labour while claiming they were simply running factories. all face. Same question. Hoth's career raises, can professional excellence exist separately from moral responsibility, or does excellence without ethics become instrument of evil? The consensus answer is that professional roles don't create moral exemptions. Doctors must heal ethically, lawyers must practice justice justly, soldiers must fight honourably, and violations of these ethical requirements make one criminal regardless of professional competence. The final assessment must hold two truths simultaneously. Hermann Hoth was skilled operational commander and convicted war criminal, professional expert and moral failure, contributor to military art, and participant in genocidal war. Both aspects are real and neither cancels the other. His operational campaigns can be studied for lessons while his criminal conduct is acknowledged and condemned. His professional competence made him effective Wehrmacht commander, which meant he was effective instrument of Nazi aggression and crimes against humanity. There is no resolution to this tension, no way to balance the ledger, no redemption available posthumously. The shadow legacy is that we remember both the excellence and the evil, neither allowing us to forget the other. December 25th, 1971, when Hermann Hoth died, the world barely noticed. He wasn't Rommel, immortalized through mythology. He wasn't Guderian, famous through self-promotion. He was an obscure old man whose complicated past made him neither hero nor monster, but something more troubling, highly competent professional who served a terrible cause. This makes his legacy more relevant, not less. Easy villains and clear heroes teach simple lessons. Complex figures like Hoth teach harder truths, that evil regimes employ skilled people, that professional excellence without ethical foundation becomes dangerous, that following orders is never adequate moral defense, that institutional complicity produces individual guilt. These lessons matter because circumstances that produced Hoth's moral failures haven't disappeared. Professional soldiers still face questions about what orders to follow, what conduct to tolerate, what values to maintain under pressure. Hoth's career, studied honestly, with both his competence and his criminality acknowledged, teaches that professionalism requires ethical grounding, that being good at your job is insufficient if the job serves evil purpose. The inheritance of iron that began with Hoth's birth in 1885, that transformed through Prussian academies and mechanized revolution, that achieved triumph in France and catastrophe in Russia, that ended with conviction and imprisonment. This inheritance was both gift and curse. The Prussian military tradition that shaped Hoth emphasized duty, competence, obedience, professional excellence. These values produced extraordinarily capable military institutions. They also produced officers who served criminal regimes effectively, because they'd been trained to serve effectively, regardless of regime's character. The lesson of Hoth's life is that professional military excellence requires ethical constraints, that duty must be bounded by morality, that competence without conscience produces catastrophe. His shadow legacy is reminder visible in military academies, where his campaigns are studied, in courtroom transcripts where his crimes are documented, in historical assessments that refuse to choose between his excellence and his evil, that military professionals must be more than professionally excellent. They must be morally grounded, ethically constrained, and willing to refuse criminal orders regardless of professional consequences. Hermann Hoth failed this test. His life, honestly examined, teaches why that failure matters and why the questions it raises remain urgently relevant. The shadow he casts is long, and we ignore it at our peril.